especially if it's a new government or a former.
There seems to be a concerted effort in a lot of areas to keep buried ancient texts and indigenous narratives. As you mentioned before, sometimes in really brutal and inhumane ways, especially during like the periods of colonization. Could you elaborate a bit more on why you think this happens? What is so dangerous about these ancient narratives that they have to be so forcefully buried?
I think that any government wants full spectrum dominance over its population. Any government wants to be the arbiter of what's true, not true, what's news and what's fake news, and especially if it's a new government or a force that's invaded and colonized another country. If you say there was no massacre in that square, then you don't want other news agencies saying there was, or you don't want other authorities bringing another story. If you go and take over a country, you want to provide the education and the science. You don't want the local priesthoods or local authorities contradicting you at every turn. If you want to be the source of information about life, the universe, and everything, you don't want people having direct contact experiences with powerful entities saying, no, that's not true, this is the case. It's just not going to be welcome anywhere. So when the Portuguese and Spanish went into Central and South America, they executed the nobles, the royals, and the priesthoods so that there would be no other authority present. And they incinerated the written heritage of those cultures so that the only information would be Catholic information. And that's happened the world over. Sometimes it happens in more subtle ways. So when Britain went into Ghana, for instance, between 1874 and 1950, it didn't do those things, though it had been equally brutal in other places. But it did shame those other authorities into silence. The idea was that if you were going to get on in British Ghana, then you would look British, think British, act British, dress British, and then you look like a good candidate for a good job, promotion, etc. So if you had a mother or a grandmother who had not fully bought into the British ways and who still was doing old religion, contact protocols, oh, that's a witch doctor, that's an idol worshipper. And that sort of dark, demonizing language was done to make you ashamed of your own heritage so that you would buy in to the British imperial model. And that's how it was done there, so that people would be embarrassed to take seriously the old ways. And you've got a whole spectrum in between those two things. But it's been very deliberate, very conscious, very intentional. If you look at what happened in Australia, Canada, and the USA, there was a 100-year period, the same period, across those three countries. Between 1880 and 1980, a concerted effort to eradicate the information of the indigenous peoples. There was a stolen generation policy where children would be taken forcibly from their parents so they couldn't be brought up in their indigenous ways. They'd be brought up in boarding schools and have Christian orthodoxy filled into them. And now we've got a truth and reconciliation process in Canada because we realize how brutal that regime was. 150,000 First Nation Canadian children kidnapped and effectively imprisoned in youth detention centers for reprogramming, and more than 10,000 of those were murdered by the nuns and the priests who supposedly were educating them. That is what has surfaced, and more of that information has surfaced while I've been writing Echoes of Eden. And the Truth and Reconciliation process has concluded this was a deliberate attempt at cultural genocide. They wanted the whole culture to stop, and they wanted to stop information that those cultures had curated, and they wanted to stop higher cognitive abilities that were nurtured by those cultures. That's why the first thing you do, apparently, to a First Nation Canadian child, when you kidnap them at the age of 6 and you imprison them, is you shave off all their hair, because you know that hair is very important to the shamanic abilities of those people. It's got nothing to do with education. You don't need to shave people's hair off to make them Christians, but they were doing it to cut them off from their culture and from information. In the USA, the initiation ceremonies that passed this information and these skills on from generation to generation were illegalized for 100 years to try and put a stop to it. So those are just examples of the governments wanting to silence the voice of these other cultures. It didn't discontinue them as a people group, but it wanted all the information and understanding that they carried to be stopped, so that people today would not be able to do what their ancestors could do and would not know what their ancestors knew.
Give thanks and praise. Give thanks and praise. Give thanks and praise to the Most High. Now, when you listen to that information, it should give people an idea, especially my local West Indians, so-called Caribbean people. This information should give you an idea of what took place here, because I hear them mention one specific or particular group of people we would consider foreign, came to the location of all the indigenous so-called peoples, and they literally usurped their place, or at least their authority or their birthright. That's what the foreigners have done and is still trying to do. So a little information like that should send some people on a path to do some more investigation, bring closure to that specific kind of information. Now, this information now what we're going to bring forward, they were white and they were slaves. The untold history of the enslavement of early white America. And I'll let the computer read for a little bit. This information is not known, but we'll just repeat this thing and see how far we can, break it down.
They were white and they were slaves. The untold history of the enslavement of whites in early America. Michael A. Hoffman 2. http://www.hoffman-info.com. Introduction. They were of two sorts. First, such as were brought over by masters of ships to be sold as servants. Such as we call them, my dear, says she, but they are more properly called slaves. Daniel Defoe, Malflanders. This is a history of white people that has never been told in any coherent form, largely because most modern historians have, for reasons of politics or psychology, refused to recognize white slaves in early America as just that. Today, not a tear is shed for the sufferings of millions of our own enslaved forefathers. 200 years of white slavery in America have been almost completely obliterated from the collective memory of the American people. Who wants to be reminded that half, perhaps as many as thirds, of the original American colonists came here, not of their own free will, but kidnapped, shanghaied, impressed, duped, beguiled, and yes, in chains? We tend to gloss over it. We'd prefer to forget the whole sorry chapter. Elaine Kendall, Los Angeles Times, September 1st, 1985. A correct understanding of the authentic history of the enslavement of whites in America could have profound consequences for the future of the races. We cannot be sure that the position of the earliest Africans differed markedly from that of the white indentured servants. The debate has considerable significance for the interpretation of race relations in American history. Eugene D. Genovese, Roll, Jordan Roll, The World the Slaves Made, page 31. Most of the books on white labor in early America are titled with words like white indentured servitude, white bondservants, white servants, etc. It is interesting that white people who were bound to a condition of what became in many cases permanent chattel slavery unto death are not referred to as slaves by establishment academics. With the massive concentration of educational and media resources on the Negro experience of slavery, the unspoken assumption has been that only blacks have been enslaved to any degree or magnitude worthy of study or memorial. The historical record reveals that this is not the case, however. White people have been sold as slaves for centuries. White slavery in ancient and medieval Europe. Among the ancient Greeks, despite their tradition of democracy, the enslavement of fellow whites, even fellow Greeks, was the order of the day. Aristotle considered white slaves as things. The Romans also had no compunctions against enslaving whites, who they too termed a thing, res. In his agricultural writings, the 1st century BC Roman philosopher Varro labeled white slaves as nothing more than tools that happened to have voices, instrumenti vocale. Cato the Elder, discoursing on plantation management, proposed that white slaves when old or ill should be discarded along with worn-out farm implements. Julius Caesar enslaved as many as 1 million whites from Gaul, some of whom were sold to the slave dealers who followed his victorious legions. William D. Phillips, Jr., Slavery from Roman Times to the Early Transatlantic Trade, page 18. In AD 319, the Christian emperor of Rome, Constantine, ruled that if an owner whipped his white slave to death, he should not stand in any criminal accusation if the slave dies, and all statutes of lenitatiae and legal interpretations are hereby set aside. The Romans enslaved thousands of the early white inhabitants of Great Britain who were known as Angles, from which we derive the term Anglo-Saxon as a description of the English race. In the 6th century, Pope Gregory I witnessed blonde-haired, blue-eyed English boys awaiting sale in a slave market in Rome. Inquiring of their origin, the Pope was told they were Angles. Gregory replied, "Non Angli, sed Angeli, not Angles, but angels." 2. When the Franks conquered the Visigoths in southern Gaul, huge numbers of whites entered the slave markets. After Charlemagne's conquest of Saxony, during which many pagan Saxons were enslaved, he set up a network of parish churches. To provide for the maintenance of the priest and the church, those living in the parish were to donate a house and land as well as a male and female, Saxon, slave to the church for every 120 people in the parish. William Phillips. Page 52. Arabs and the traffic in white slaves. The trade in white slaves was one of the few sources of foreign exchange for Western European powers in a period when the East produced the goods that Europeans could not procure elsewhere. The sale of white slaves to Asia and Africa was one of the few sources of gold for European treasure, i.e. From the 8th to the 11th century, France was a major transfer point for white slaves to the Muslim world, with Rouen being the center for the selling of Irish and Flemish slaves. At the same time that France was a transfer point for slaves to the Muslim world, Italy was occupying much the same position. Venetians were selling slaves and timber across the Mediterranean. The slaves were usually slaves brought across the Alps. The Venetians were the earliest successful Italian sea traders, and because profits on slave trade with the Muslims were lucrative, they resisted efforts to stop them. In return for their exports of timber, iron, and white slaves, they brought in Oriental luxury products, mainly fine cloths. William Phillips, pages 62 to 63. The stereotype from establishment consensus history is of the Muslim slaver herding chained blacks through the desert. In fact, for 700 years, until the fall of Muslim Spain, those being herded were first and foremost overwhelmingly white.
The Muslim, very same Muslim, very same Moors, which is separate and distinct from our people here in the Americas. At this time, we had no contact with these Moors of Spain. Yeah, we always clash with these people who look like us, who want to impose their brand of religion with their God on us. However, remember I tell you, all of these religions were usurped by a foreign entity. So this was the manifestation of these things. The Muslim people were pure and true, know the truth and a function like how you say. These people were act. And when I said these people, I talk about the new Muslim, the one them were usurped, the Catholic usurped, Judaism and usurped, Muslim, Islam. Very same people.
Before the 10th century, the Muslims generally bought Christian Europeans as slaves. By the 10th century, Slavs became the most numerous imported group. During the late Middle Ages, until the fall of Granada in the late 15th century, most slaves of the Muslims were Christians from the northern kingdoms. William Phillips, page 69. In the vast lands of the Eastern European steppes from the 8th to the 12th century, there was a well-developed slaving network. Slavs and Finns, called Sakaliba, slaves, indiscriminately by the Muslims, entered the Muslim world by these Caspian and Black Sea routes. William Phillips, pages 63-64. The fate of the hundreds of thousands of white slaves sold to the Arabs was described in one Spanish text as atrocissima et ferocissima, most atrocious and harsh. The men were worked to death as galley slaves. The women, girls, and boys were used as prostitutes. White males had their genitals mutilated in castration attempts, bloody procedures of incredible brutality which most of the white men who were forced to submit did not survive, judging from the high prices white eunuchs commanded throughout the Middle Eastern slave markets. Escape from North Africa and the Middle East was almost impossible, and those white slaves who were caught trying to flee were punished by having their noses and ears cut off, or worse. Early Muslim texts provide insights into the extent to which the Arabs identified Europeans with slavery, classified white slaves as animals, and even produced learned racist disquisitions on the supposed merits of emasculated East European slaves. In his 9th century treatise on beasts, the Book of Animals, the Muslim scholar Jais writes, another change which overcomes the eunuch, of two slaves of Slavic race, who are twins, one castrated and the other not, the eunuch becomes more disposed towards service, wiser, more able, and apt for various problems of manual labor. All these qualities you find only in the castrated one. On the other hand, his brother continues to have the same native torpor, the same lack of natural talent, the same imbecility common to slaves, and incapacity for learning a foreign language. Charles Verlinden, The Slave in Medieval Europe, Volume 1, page 213. 3. Whites were also enslaved in Russia, and I do not refer here to serfdom, which was a later development. Knowledge of the existence of slavery in early modern Russia is not widespread. Many people know of the existence of serfdom and confuse the 2-inch Richard Helley, Slavery in Russia, 1450-1725, page 17. The white Russian Muscovites were enslaved both by Northern European raiders as well as massive slave-catching operations launched by the Mongols and the Ottoman Empire. Russians also enslaved each other to such an extent that in 1571 an official slave chancellery was established which formally codified white slavery as a Russian institution. Helley, page 118. Viking slavers. In the 9th century, the Vikings sold tens of thousands of whites to the Arabs of Spain. According to Michael Wood's book, In Search of the Dark Ages. An Arab traveler of the time who came to Spain remarked on the great numbers of European slaves in harems and in the militia. The palace of the Emir of Cordoba, in particular, had many white girls. Of these unfortunate people, the Vikings were undoubtedly a major source of supply. The Arabs in Spain saw the long-term potential of this trade, and as early as the 840s sent a diplomatic mission to Scandinavia to put it on an organized basis. The most westerly component of the early medieval slave trade in Europe was the British Isles. In the 11th century, the Vikings were active slave traders in Ireland. From Ireland, the Vikings took the slaves to be sold in Muslim Spain and Scandinavia, and even to be transported into Russia. Some may have been taken as far as Constantinople and the Muslim Middle East. William Phillips, page 63. The Norwegian slave trader was an important enough figure to appear in the 12th century tale of Tristan. Icelandic literature also provides numerous references to raiding in Ireland as a source for slaves. Norwegian Vikings made slave raids not only against the Irish and Scots, who are often called Irish in Norse sources, but also against Norse settlers in Ireland or the Scottish Isles or even in Norway itself. Slave trading was a major commercial activity of the Viking Age. Ruth Mazo-Karas, Slavery and Society in Medieval Scandinavia, page 49. The children of white slaves in Iceland were routinely murdered en masse, Karas, page 52. White slavery in early America. David Bryan Davis, writing in the New York Review of Books, October 11, 1990, page 37, states, as late as the 14th and 15th centuries, continuing shipments of white slaves, some of them Christians, flowed from the booming slave markets on the northern Black Sea coast into Italy, Spain, Egypt, and the Mediterranean islands. From Barbados to Virginia, colonists showed few scruples about reducing their less fortunate countrymen to a status little different from that of chattel slaves. The prevalence and suffering of white slaves, serfs, and indentured servants in the early modern period suggests that there was nothing inevitable about limiting plantation slavery to people of African origin. L. Rookames, in the Sources of Racial Thought in Colonial America, states that the slave trade worked in both directions, with white merchandise as well as black. Journal of Negro History, number 52, pages 251 to 273. In 1659, the English Parliament debated the practice of selling British whites into slavery in the New World. In the debate, the whites were referred to not as indentured servants, but as slaves whose enslavement threatened the liberties of all Englishmen. Thomas Burton, Parliamentary Diary, 1656-59, Volume 4, pages 253 to 274. Foster R. Dulles in Labor in America quotes an early document describing white children in colonial servitude as crying and mourning for redemption from their slavery. 4. Dr. Hilary M.C.D. Beckles of the University of Hull, England, writes regarding white slave labor, indenture contracts were alienable, the ownership of which could easily be transferred. Like that of any other commodity, as with slaves, ownership changed without their participation in the dialogue concerning transfer. Beckles refers to indentured servitude as white proto-slavery, the Americas, Volume 41, Number 2, page 21. In the Calendar of State Papers, Colonial Series, America and West Indies of 1701, we read of a protest over the encouragement to the spiriting away of Englishmen without their consent and selling them for slaves, which hath been a practice very frequent and known by the name of kidnapping. Emphasis added. In the British West Indies, plantation slavery was instituted as early as 1627. In Barbados, by the 1640s there were an estimated 25,000 slaves, of whom 21,700 were white. Some observations on the island of Barbados, Calendar of State Papers, Colonial Series, p. 528. It is worth noting that while white slaves were worked to death in Barbados, there were Caribbean Indians brought from Guyana to help propagate native foodstuffs who were well treated and received as free persons by the wealthy planters. Of the fact that the wealth of Barbados was founded on the backs of white slave labor there can be no doubt. White slave laborers from Britain and Ireland were the mainstay of the sugar colony. Until the mid-1640s there were few blacks in Barbados. George Downing wrote to John Winthrop, the colonial governor of Massachusetts in 1645, that planters who wanted to make a fortune in the British West Indies must procure white slave labor out of England if they wanted to succeed. Elizabeth Donnan, Documents Illustrative of the History of the Slave Trade to America, pages 125 to 126. White indentured servants were employed and treated, incidentally, exactly like slaves. Morley Ayerst, The British West Indies, page 19. The many gradations of unfreedom among whites made it difficult to draw fast lines between any idealized free white worker and a pitted or scorned servile black worker. In labor-short 17th and 18th century America, the work of slaves and that of white servants were virtually interchangeable in most areas. David R. Roediger, The Wages of Whiteness, Race and the Making of the American Working Class, page 25. In the Massachusetts Court of Assistants, whose records date to 1633, we find a 1638 description of a white man, one Giles player, as having been delivered up for a slave. The Englishman William Eddies, after observing white slaves in America in the 1770s, wrote, "General ally speaking, they groan beneath a worse than Egyptian bondage." Letters from America, London, 1792. Governor Sharp of the Maryland colony compared the property interest of the planters in their white slaves with the estate of an English farmer consisting of a multitude of cattle. The Quackwalker case in Massachusetts in 1783, which ruled that slavery was contrary to the state constitution, was applied equally to blacks and whites in Massachusetts. Patrick F. Moran, in his historical sketch of the persecutions suffered by the Catholics of Ireland, refers to the transportation of the Irish to the colonies as the slave trade, pages 343 to 346. The disciplinary and revenue laws of early Virginia, circa 1631 to 1645, did not discriminate Negroes in bondage from whites in bondage. William Henning, editor, Statutes at Large of Virginia, Volume 1, pages 174, 198, 200, 243, 306. For records of wills in which lands, goods and chattels, cattle, monies, any grows, English servants, horses, sheep and household stuff were all sold together, see the Lancaster County Records in Virginia Colonial Abstracts, Beverly Fleet, editor. Lay historian Colonel A.B. Ellis, writing in the British newspaper Argosy, May 6, 1893. Few, but read heirs of old colonial state papers and records, are aware that between the years 1649 to 1690 a lively trade was carried on between England and the plantations, as the colonies were then called, in political prisoners, where they were sold by auction to the colonists for various terms of years, sometimes for life as slaves. Sir George Sandys's 1618 plan for Virginia referred to bound whites assigned to the treasurers of fiefs to belong to said office forever. The service of whites bound to Berkeley's 100 was 5. Deemed perpetual. Lewis Cecil Gray, History of Agriculture in the Southern United States to 1860, Volume 1, pages 316, 318. Certainly, the enslaved whites themselves recognized their condition with painful clarity. As one white man, named Abram, who was accused of trying to agitate a rebellion, stated to his fellows, "Wherefore should we stay here and be slaves?" In a statement smuggled out of the New World and published in London, whites in bondage did not call themselves indentured servants. In their writing they referred to themselves as England's slaves and England's merchandise. Marcellus Rivers and Oxenbridge Foyle, England's Slavery, 1659. Eyewitnesses like Père Labat, who visited the West Indian slave plantations of the 17th century, which were built and manned by white slaves, labeled them white slaves and nothing less. Memoirs of Père Labat, 1693 to 1705, page 125. Even blacks referred to the white forced laborers in the colonies as white slaves. Colonial Office, Public Records Office, London, 1667, number 170, Sotweed Factor, or A Voyage to Maryland, a pamphlet circulated in 1708, articulates the plight of tens of thousands of pathetic young white girls kidnapped from England and enslaved in colonial America, lamenting that, "In better times ere to this land I was unhappily trepanned, not then a slave. But things are changed. Kidnapped and fooled." The height of academic and media fraud is revealed in the monopolistic trademark status the official controllers of education and mass communications have successfully established between the definition of the word slave and the Negro, while labeling descriptions of the historic experience of whites in slavery a fallacy. Yet the very word slave, which the establishment's consensus school of history pretends cannot legitimately be applied to whites, is derived from the word Slavic. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, the word slave is another name for the white people of Eastern Europe, the Slavs. Compact edition of the Oxford English Dictionary, p. 2858. In other words, slave has always been a term for and a definition of a servile condition of white people. Yet we are told by the professorcrats that it is not correct to refer to whites as slaves, but only as servants, even though the very root of the word is derived from the historical fact of white Slav. Airy, 1. A Holocaust against the white poor. White slavery and bondage in British colonial America cannot be fully understood without also understanding how British whites came to be dehumanized in their homeland across the sea. The desperate condition of the poor whites of Britain was most obvious in the cities. The English slums of the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries were pits of white suffering. London's Street Giles was known locally as Rat's Castle. A policeman who worked the area used metaphors from the insect world to describe the conditions of the poor whites there, referring to them as vermin-haunted heaps of rags. opening the door to a tiny shack. The policeman discovered 10, 20, 30, who can count them? Men, women, children, for the most part naked, heaped upon the floor like maggots in a cheese, a spectral rising, unshrouded, from a grave of rags. On duty with Inspector Field, in Household Words, June 14, 1851, pages 265 to 267. Herman Melville, in his autobiographical account of his first voyage as a sailor, described the same living death in the English port city of Liverpool in 1839. L generally passed through a narrow street called Launcelot's Hay. Once passing through this place, L heard a feeble wail. It seemed the low, hopeless, endless wail of someone forever lost. 6. At last I advanced to an opening, to deep tiers of cellars beneath a crumbling old warehouse, and there, some 15 feet below the walk, crouching in nameless squalor, with her head bowed over, was the figure of what had been a woman. Her blue arms folded to her livid bosom, two shrunken things like children that leaned toward her, one on each side. At first, I knew not whether they were alive or dead. They were dumb and next to dead with want. How they had crawled into that den, I could not tell, but there they had crawled to die. Elle tried to lift the woman's head, but feeble as she was, she seemed bent upon holding it down. Observing her arms clasped upon her bosom, and that something seemed hidden under the rags there, a thought crossed my mind which impelled me forcibly to withdraw her hands for a moment, when I caught glimpse of a meager little babe, the lower part of its body thrust into an old bonnet. Its face was dazzling white, even in its squalor, but the closed eyes looked like balls of indigo. It must have been dead some hours. I stood looking down on them, while my whole soul swelled within me, and I asked myself, what right had any body in the wide world to smile and be glad when sights like this were to be seen? Melville, Redburn, His First Voyage, Anchor Books edition, pages 173 to 178. Such is the course of 19 out of 20 of the fatal cases originating in deficiency of food, as they occur among the destitute poor in our large towns, the first effect of the gradual starvation to which these persons are subjected. It is a strange anomaly to see in wealthy, civilized, Christian England, multitudes of men living in the lowest state of physical degradation and absolutely perishing from neglect. The fact is undeniable that no inconsiderable portion of our fellow creatures is living on food and in dwellings scarcely fit for brutes, certainly worse provided for than many of our domestic animals, and that the death of numbers is accelerated or indirectly produced by gradual and protracted starvation. Joseph Adshed, Distress in Manchester, Evidence Tabular and Otherwise of the State of the Laboring Classes in 1840 to 1842, pages 49 to 50. Charles Darwin's uncle, factory owner Josiah Wedgwood, owned a business that worked white children of 5 years of age in a chemical factory permeated with lead oxide, a deadly poison. Wedgwood acknowledged that the lead made the children very subject to disease, but worked them anyway. The English writer Francis Trollope estimated that at least 200,000 English children were snatched away to factories, taken and lodged amid stench and stunning, terrifying tumult, driven to and fro until their little limbs bend under them, the repose of a moment to be purchased only by yielding their tender bodies to the fist, the heel, or the strap of the overseer. Marcus Cunliffe, Chattel Slavery and Wage Slavery, page 73. In 1723, the Waltham Act was passed, which classified more than 200 minor offenses, such as steal a rabbit from an aristocrat or breaking up his fish pond, a crime punishable by hanging. Starving youths, 14 years old, were strung up on Tyburn gallows for stealing as little as one sheep. When their bodies were cut down, their parents had to fight over them with agents of the Royal College of Physicians who had been empowered by the courts to use their remains for laboratory dissection. The English historian William Cobbett stated in 1836, "The starving agricultural laborers of southern England are worse off than American Negroes." when in 1834 English farm workers in Dorset tried to form a union in order to preserve ourselves, our wives and our children from starvation, they were shipped into slavery in Australia for this crime. The situation of white factory workers was no better. Robert Owen declared in 1840, "The working classes of Great Britain are in a worse condition than any slaves in any country, in any period of the world's history." In 19th century England, tens of thousands of white children were employed as slave laborers in British coal mines. Little white boys, 7 years old, were harnessed like donkeys to coal carts and ordered to drag them through mine shafts. In 1843, white children aged 4 were working in the coal pits. In Old English cemeteries can be seen epitaphs on gravestones like one which reads, "William Smith, aged 8 years, miner, died January 3, 1841. The root of the Holocaust against the white yeomanry of Britain lies in the history of the land swindles perpetrated against them in the late 12th and early 13th centuries. 7. As the lords obtained their rights against the king as formalized in the Magna Carta, they used them to expropriate the land rights of the yeoman by means of the writ of novel disseisin and what historian Rodney Hilton describes as other lawyers' traps. Ownership was transferred to the lords. The people were allowed to remain on their ancestral lands with something akin to a sharecropper's status. By the 17th century, even this tenancy was being eroded by the introduction of the enclosure laws, which fenced off land heretofore farmed in common by the people, as the landlords began to enforce their property rights. The net effect of enclosure, though it was at first slow in coming, was the eviction of the people from the land, a process begun toward the end of Elizabeth's reign, necessitating the first poor relief law for able-bodied, unemployed persons, known as the 43rd Elizabeth, after the year of her reign in which it had been enacted, 1601. This act transformed the old laws concerning community self-help based on voluntary, local alms. Giving to a general tax or rate paying, administered through the Church of England for distribution in local parishes. As noble as the intent of the law may seem, it was little more than a token measure, intended not to halt the flood of misery generated by the dispossession of the British yeoman, but rather to placate the consciences of those who could see all too well the emergence of a new pattern of starvation and poverty, previously known in Britain mainly in times of war or pestilence. The introduction of the 43rd Elizabeth marked the beginning of a holocaust against the poor of Britain justified by jurists and aristocrats and operated in the absence of the revolution in land reform which would have returned the farms to the people and effected the only genuine remedy for the poverty beginning to grip the working class. To alleviate the symptoms of the land dispossession, for systems of bondage would evolve: 1. Poor relief. 2. White slavery in the colonies. 3. The workhouse. 4. The factory system. They would all develop their special horrors, each justified by pointing to the evils intrinsic in the previous scheme to help the poor. Poor relief institutionalized the new stigma of pauperism and parasitism which the ruling class attached to the impoverished condition of the dispossessed yeomanry, as homelessness and starvation increased. It was laid down that all recipients of poor relief should be compelled to wear the letter P on their sleeves, and that they should be whipped if they neglected or refused to do so. The P stood for a word which had already acquired its lasting stigma: pauper. Brian Inglis, Poverty and the Industrial Revolution, page 17. The next phase of relief for indigent British whites was their enslavement in the American Colorado-Nice, which was made acceptable on the basis of the pauperism created by the enclosure laws and the dehumanization of the British poor as a lower order of man, when their humanity was conceded at all. Enslavement on the colonial plantations of America became a mercy because it transported whites of mean estate out of the wretched streets and hovels of Britain by means of courts of assize and press gangs. The political economy of the Industrial Revolution. Enslavement overseas would not prove sufficient for the disposal of all of Britain's surplus poor, however. The workhouse system, instituted by such high church Tories as Sir Humphrey Mackworth, flattered itself with the claim that the poor people of Britain were generally in the fix that they were, due to their own folly and lack of virtue, and that habits of thrift and industry could be instilled by imprisoning them in fortress-like buildings, thereby removing them from the perils of the press gangs, the assize courts and the street, where the propertied classes would have had to endure the spectacle of their starvation. The public expenditure connected with the construction and operation of the workhouse system was a source of self-congratulation for the aristocracy. Now the white poor could starve slowly in privacy. 8. Instead of publicly on the street, with a sop to the conscience in the expectation that some might survive and learn generosity toward their betters and virtuous habits in the bargain. In the year 1765, 23 indigent children were placed in the care of the Street Clement Danes workhouse. By January of the following year 2 had been discharged and 18 were dead. In the same time period, of 78 children placed in the care of the workhouse at Holborn, 64 were dead. Of 18 children who entered St. George's Middlesex workhouse, 16 departed in a coffin. In the workhouse of the combined parishes of St. Giles, Indiana, the Fields, and St. George's, Bloomsbury, the mortality rate for English children was 90%, moving one contemporary observer to opine that placing children in the workhouse is but a small remove from slaughter, for the child must die. One is reminded of the remark of the English legal scholar William Blackstone, "It is much easier to extirpate than to amend mankind." As the workhouse was revealed to be a mansion of putridity, a humane reform along scientific lines was called for, and into the breach stepped the political economist Jeremy Bentham. Bentham's philosophy viewed the workhouse, when properly implemented according to the latest principles in pauper administration and the panopticon principle of construction, as the scientific management of poor whites. Bentham's supposedly humane, model Panopticon workhouse was even more tomb-like and regimented than its predecessors, and amounted to the creation of a prison warehouse for the storage of that vexatious species of humanity, the white pauper. +1. An expose of political economy appears in Charles Dickens' Oliver Twist in his characterization of the Bentham and Ricardo philosophers on the board of supervisors of a workhouse. The members of this board were very sage, deep, philosophical men, and when they came to turn their attention to the workhouse, they found out at once, what ordinary folks would never have discovered, that poor people liked it. It was a regular place of public entertainment for the poorer classes. A brick and mortar elysium, they established the rule that all poor people should have the alternative, for they would compel nobody, not they, of being starved by a gradual process in the work house, or by a quick one out of it. They made a great many other wise and humane regulations. Oliver Twist, Penguin Classics edition, page 55. In the last stage of management of the British poor, the factory system of white slavery was instituted, the horrors of which were defended with the argument that its alternative was either the workhouse or enslavement overseas. Inside the factory, death was by no means certain, and self-respect, conferred by the captains of industry, wages and sustenance, could be obtained. Therefore, the factory system of white slavery was yet another mercy, in the long history of mercifully substituting one form of enslavement of the British yeomanry for another, and calling the process progress and the advancement of civilization. The The advocates of all four of these systems of human organization have seldom argued their merits in comparison with the way of life offered the people by a traditional culture of craft making and farm ing the land. To do so would be to compare the traditional rural existence of the white farmer and cottage handcraft worker with the modern organization of the white working class. In such an analogy, the evils of the latter would be overwhelmingly obvious. Once land, the source of the independence of the British yeoman, had been removed, the resulting dependency attached to the white poor the station of servility, a process whose groundwork had been laid with the juridical defeat of ancestral peasant land claims as a result of the establishment of the concept of villein tenure in the 12th century, the consequences of which, evictions and enclosure, were not experienced on a mass scale until the Stuart era. One Bentham had his elderly butler hanged for stealing 2 silver spoons. John Vincent, hanging, a weapon of class war, Sunday Telegraph, November 24, 1991. 9. The attitude of the propertied classes toward the class of penurious whites created by the avarice of the aristocracy was expressed candidly by Joseph Townsend in his dissertation on the Poor Laws and by the Scottish magistrate Lord Braxfield in the 1793 trial of Thomas Muir. Muir had been arrested for the crime of advocating the right to vote for white working men. At his trial, Braxfield ruled that Mr. Muir might have known that no attention could be paid by Parliament to such a rabble, the white workers who had petitioned for voting rights. What right have they to representation? A government in every country should be just like a corporation, and in this country it is made up of the landed interest, which alone has the right to be represented. John F. Mackison, Bristol Transported, page 13. Joseph Townsend argued both for the necessity of cheap white labor in boom economic times to relieve delicate, rich people from the need to perform drudgery, as well as for the elimination of the white surplus poor through starvation during times of economic depression. In good economic times, Townsend claimed that it was only natural that there should be destitute white people, so that there may always be some to fulfill the most servile, the most sordid, and the most ignoble offices in the community. The stock of human happiness is thereby much increased, while the more delicate are relieved from drudgery. During economic downturns, some check, some balance, is therefore absolutely needful, and hunger is the proper balance. This plutocratic ideology, systematized in the late 18th century, was not a new or minority view. It had been expressed before, but with more wit and cant. Now, what had previously been discussed only in councils of state and the drawing rooms of the aristocracy was printed in the open, for public circulation and approbation from the high-born. The ideas of modernity and progress, with their Benthamite view of tradition as a toxic encumbrance, eclipsed the customary restraints of mercantilism with every glimmer of the coming of the Machine Age. The doctrine of the inferiority of the white yeomanry and their expendability in the name of the cause of advancing civilization was formulated to a greater degree with the publication in 1798 of the Rev. Thomas R. Malthus an essay of the principle of population, greatly expanded and revised into 2 volumes in 1803. Malthus argued it was pointless to provide relief for the poor because this was a futile exercise, calculated simply to perpetuate their misery. He went further, denying that the white poor had any right to relief. Inglis, page 69. Malthus reasoned that as long as hungry whites received food from charity, they would continue having more children. Malthus demanded moral restraint, celibacy, from impoverished married white couples who, because they were poor, had no right to have children, in his view. Their only moral course was self-extinction, and with their eventual demise as a class, so too would poverty be extinguished, according to Malthus. Moral restraint, he argued, could operate among the poor only with very inconsiderable force, because the poor law removed the need for it by offering allowances for children. Abolish the allowances, and the poor who exercised moral restraint would then be rewarded if they had no more children than they could afford, or better, no children at all. Inglis, pages 70 to 71. Malthus provided the perfect solution to a problem which had long haunted the British ruling class, the surplus white population who always presented the potential for revolutionary overthrow of the system of privilege. Their devaluation over the centuries, from villain to slave to pauper to felon, had now reached its nadir. Those not gainfully employed would be starved to death, all for the maximum good of society. The political economist David Ricardo also advocated the starvation of unemployed whites. By engaging to feed all who may require food, you in some measure create an unlimited demand for human beings. The population and the rates, taxes, would go on increasing in a regular progression until the rich were reduced to poverty. Inglis, pages 149 to 150. Here was the raison d'etre of the machine age. The factory owners announced that they would take the white refuse doomed to otherwise starve and actually pay them. Thus was paved the way for 10. The acceptance of factory slavery, celebrated as a mercy and the salvation of an otherwise bestial and valueless creature, the penurious white adult and child. If this assessment appears to place too great an emphasis on what, in retrospect, was merely a fleeting and aberrant 1790s dogma of an industrial revolution which quickly disabused itself of such extreme plutocratic thinking, one may cite a book written in 1990 by Clemson University economist Clark Nardinelli, which attempts to make the case that the worst crime of the Industrial Revolution, the enslavement, maiming, and death of 5, 6, and 7-year-old white children in factories, was, given the circumstances, a benefit and an opportunity. Nardinelli's book has been hailed as a major achievement and the definitive history of the period of the Industrial Revolution. This recent work takes the same attitude toward white child slaves as their 18th century factory overseers. The views of the robber barons are being celebrated in the 1990s as the historically correct response toward poor whites. In defending the enslavement of white children in factories, the professor writes, an idyllic childhood devoted to education and play was simply not possible for most white children. Child Labor and the Industrial Revolution, page 156.2. One wonders what sort of reception Nardinelli and his university publisher would have received had he justified the enslavement of Negro children in the antebellum South on the basis that an idyllic childhood devoted to education and play was simply not possible for most black children. As we shall see, Nardinelli's apologia is part of a long line of both capitalist and supposedly humanitarian socialist thinkers for whom two different standards of morality have obtained, what qualified as oppression of Negro slaves and what qualified as oppression for white ones, beginning with the fact that it has been ruled improper to even refer to white slaves as such, and concluding with economic arguments in favor of white enslavement which, were they to be advanced in precisely the same terms toward any other race of people, would be denounced as an egregious denial of fundamental human rights. That such a denial of the rights of the white laborer and the violence done to those rights is still current and influential 200 years after Bentham, Malthus, Ricardo, and Townsend, illustrates the low status of white working and poor people even in our own time. One may here argue that child labor in factories, while repellent, was not slavery. Such an argument can only be based on a 20th century conception of a factory as a place merely of regimentation. The factories of the late 18th and early 19th centuries were very different establishments. The factory system, 1830, the Reverend Richard Ostler, a Methodist minister in York, protested the conditions in the Bradford woolen mills where young children labored and were beaten if they fell asleep. Ostler attacked the hypocrisy of Yorkshire clergymen and politicians who condemned with great fervor the enslavement of blacks in the West Indies, while in England, thousands of our fellow creatures are this very moment in a state of slavery more horrid than are the victims of that hellish system, colonial slavery. The very streets which receive the droppings of an anti-slavery society are every morning wet by the tears of innocent victims at the accursed shrine of avarice, who are compelled, not by the cart whip of the Negro slave driver, but by the dread of the equally appalling thang, or strap, of the 2 on page 171. Nardinelli claims that Charles Dickens, though a severe critic of child labor, did not write about child labor in any of his novels, with the exception of a brief passage in David Copperfield. Nardinelli is ignorant of the scene in Oliver Twist, wherein Oliver is slated to be apprenticed to a master of chimney sweeps named Gamfield, whose countenance, Dickens informs us, was a regular stamped receipt for cruelty. Oliver was initially sold to Gamfield for slightly more than £3, despite the fact that the master of sweeps did happen to labor under the slight imputation of having bruised 3 or 4 boys to death already. A fortuitous turn of events caused the magistrate to void Oliver's chimney sweep indentures at the last moment. Few workhouse orphans were as fortunate as Oliver Twist to escape from the clutches of chimney sweepers of Mr. Gamfield's ilk. George L. Phillips, England's Climbing Boys, page 4. 11. Overlooker, to hasten, half-dressed, but not half-fed, to those magazines of British infantile slavery, the worsted mills in the town of Bradford. Ostler was publicly thanked by a delegation of English laborers at a meeting in York for his manly letters to expose the conduct of those pretended philanthropists and canting hypocrites who travel to the West Indies in search of slavery, forgetting there is a more abominable and degrading system of slavery at home. Cecil Driver, Tory Radical, The Life of Richard Ostler, pages 36 to 55, Lunglis, page 260. The Industrial Revolution's factory labor force consisted primarily of white children from the workhouses who were seized and placed in the factories under a spurious indentured apprentice system. Here, then, was a ready source of labor, and a very welcome one. The children, provided with employment, would be rescued from pauperism, and the ratepayers, taxpayers, would be relieved of their part of the burden. So mill owners began to appear in London, visiting parish officers, and ing the necessary arrangements. The children were formally indentured as apprentices. What happened to them was nobody's concern. A parish in London, having got rid of a batch of unwanted pauper children, was unlikely to interest itself in their subsequent fate. The term apprenticeship was in any case a misnomer. Lunglis, pages 75 to 76, 81. Many employers imported child apprentices, parish orphans from workhouses far and near. Clearly, overseers of the poor were only too keen to get rid of the orphans. Children were brought to the factories, like cartloads of live lumber, and abandoned to their fate. Poor children, taken from workhouses or kidnapped in the streets of the metropolis, used to be brought down by coach to Manchester and slid into a cellar in Mosley Street as if they had been stones or any other inanimate substance. Marjorie Cruikshank, Children and Industry, pages 13 to 14. Being indentured as pauper apprentices, children lost all ability to negotiate the terms of their bound labor. The term apprentice was a misnomer because they were not being taught a trade. Machine tending was a custodial function, not a skill. A child labeled an indentured apprentice could be paid a pittance and forced to work the longest hours. For example, to induce free English adults to work a night shift at a factory would have cost the owners more in wages. These disadvantageous terms were avoided by compelling the enslaved children to work at night. British children comprised a majority of the factory workforce. From 2/3 to 3/4 of the workers in the early factories, they were lucky if they earned a halfpenny an hour. For this they were made to work as children had never been made to work before. Inglis, page 104. For the sake of a shilling a week, at the age of 5, children who had to be carried to work and who, once there, had to be terrorized to stay awake. Cruikshank, page 20. White children worked up to 16 hours a day, and during that period the doors were locked. Children, and most of the mill workers were still children, were allowed out only to go to the necessary. In some factories it was forbidden to open my of the windows. Cotton fluff was everywhere, including on children's food, but often, as they had to stand all day, they were too fatigued to have any appetite. The child apprentices who were on night shift might stay on it for as long as 4 or 5 years. Although they were provided with dinner at midnight, the machinery did not stop. Inglis, pages 80, 163, 164, 262. This was labor without any breaks, unceasing labor. When the children fell asleep at the machines, they were lashed into wakefulness with a whip alternately known as a thong or strap. If they arrived late to the factory, talked to another child, or committed some other infraction, they were beaten with an iron bar known as a billy roller. A contemporary witness described the factory children of Manchester, England, as almost university or Sally ill-looking, small, sickly, barefoot, and ill-clad. Edward Baines, History of the Cotton Manufacture, page 462. Francis Trollope. In the room they entered, the dirty, ragged, miserable crew were all active in the performance of their various tasks, the overlookers, strap in hand, on the alert, the whirl ing spindles urging the little slaves who waited on them to movements as unceasing as their own. Michael Armstrong, Factory Boy. 12. The essential feature of factory life, as it developed in England, was that the children were enslaved. Inglis, page 104. Charles Shaw was a child laborer from the age of 7 beginning in 1839. When an adult, he wrote a book about his experiences. Fortunes were piled up on the pitiless toilings of little children, and thousands of them never saw manhood or womanhood. Their young life was used as tillage for the quick growth of wealth. I have seen sights of sickening brutality. These little white slaves were flogged at times as brutally, all things considered, as Legree flogged Uncle Tom. Nearly all England wept about 13 years later for Uncle Tom, especially the classes, but no fine lady or gentleman wept for the cruelly used English children. When I was a child, pages 18, 22, and 65. White children in the early factories were sometimes beaten to death, killed by blows from overseers. Cruikshank, page 51. Statement of Henry Dunn. The overseer carries a strap. The boys are severely strapped. There was a tenter to every flat, and he was considered as a sort of whipperin, to force the children to extra exertion. Seen wounds inflicted upon children by tenters, by Alexander Drysdale, among others, with a belt or stick, or the first thing that came uppermost. Saw a kick given by the above-mentioned Alexander Drysdale, which broke 2 ribs of a little boy. Helped to carry the boy down to a surgeon. The boy had been guilty of some trifling offense, such as calling names to the next boy. Testimony of Ellen Ferrier, factory worker. When Charles Kennedy was the overseer, he licked us very bad, beat our heads, and kicked us very bad. Testimony of Mary Scott, factory worker, was here with Charles Kennedy, seen him strike Betty Sutherland. Can't tell how often, but it was terrible often. John Fortesque, an overseer at the Milne factory in Nottingham, England, gave the following statement. There are some children so obstinate and bad they must be punished. A strap is used. Beating is necessary, on account of their being idle. We find it out this way. We give them the same number of bobbins each. When the number they ought to finish falls off, then they're corrected. They would try the patience of any man. Statement from Mr. Grant, a Manchester factory worker, April 1833. A child, not 10 years of age, having been laid at the factory one morning, had as a punishment a rope put round its neck, to which a weight of 20 pounds was attached, and thus like a galley slave it was compelled to labor. John C. Cobden, The White Slaves of England, pages 121 to 122, 144 to 145. Statement by Reverend Ostler, London, 1833. In a mill at Wigan, the children, for any slight neglect, were loaded with weights of 20 pounds, passed over their shoulders and hanging behind their backs. Then there was a murderous instrument called a billy roller, about 8 feet long and 1.5 inches in diameter, with which many children had been knocked down, and in some instances murdered by it. Times of London, February 25, 1833. An unknown writer expressed the bitter feelings of the early British factory workers. I'm up, but weary, I scarce can reach the door, and long the way and dreary. Oh, carry me once more. To help us we've no mother, to live how hard we try. They killed my little brother, like him I'll work and die. The overlooker met her, as to the frame she crept, and with the thong he beat her, and cursed her as she wept. Alas, what hours of horror made up her latest day. 13. In toil and pain and sorrow, they slowly passed away. That night a chariot passed her, while on the ground she lay, the daughters of her master an evening visit to pay. Their tender hearts were sighing as wrongs to negroes were told, while the white slave was dying who gained their father's gold. Birmingham Journal, April 14, 1833. In Bleak House, Dickens was to satirize evangelical telescopic philanthropy in the person of Mrs. Jellaby, a do-gooder so absorbed in the welfare of the African natives of Borrioboolega that she fails to notice her own family sinking into ruin. This was precisely Carlyle's point. With Irish dying in ditches, it was the worst sort of rose-pink sentimentalism to worry oneself about West Indian Negroes. Eugene R. August, Introduction to Thomas Carlyle's The Nigger Question, Crofts Classics edition, page 17. In the late 1830s, William Dodd began his exhaustive research into the condition of the English poor. He estimated that in the year 1846 alone, 10,000 English workers, many of them children, had been mangled and mutilated by machinery or otherwise disabled for life. They were abandoned and received no compensation of any kind. Many died of their injuries. Among factory children themselves, many suffered from scrofula, incipient consumption visible by the enlarged neck glands and white swellings of the joints. At best, children who survived into a due less sense outgrew the disease, though the deformities themselves persisted. In some cases, however, limbs had to be amputated, and at worst children worked until they died. Cruikshank, page 30. Young children are allowed to clean the machinery, actually while it is in motion, and consequently the fingers, hands, and arms are frequently destroyed in a moment. I have seen the whole of the arm, from the tip of the fingers to above the elbow, chopped into mincemeat, the cogwheels cutting through the skin, muscles, and in some places, through the bone. In one instance every limb but one was broken. William Dodd, The Factory System Illustrated, pages 21 to 22. Accidents were often due to children being set to clean machinery while it was still in motion. The loss of 2 or 3 fingers was not exceptional. There were more serious accidents, such as that reported by a Stockport doctor in 1840 of a girl caught by the hair and scalped from the nose to the back of the head. The manufacturer gave her 5 shillings. She died in the workhouse. Cruikshank, page 51. 19th century factory worker William Dodd stated, "Petition after petition has been sent to the 2 Houses of Parliament, to the Prime Minister, and to the Queen, concerning this unfortunate class of British subjects, but without effect. Had they only been black instead of white, their case would have been taken into consideration long ago." The Reverend Charles Edwards Lester, the great-grandson of the Puritan theologian Jonathan Edwards, and later the American consul in Italy, stated that if he had a choice between having his children born Negro slaves in the South or poor people in England, he would choose the former. "I would sooner see the children of my love born to the heritage of Southern slavery than to see them subjected to the blighting bondage of the poor English operative's life." Lester, The Glory and the Shame of England, Volume 1, page 8. John Randolph of Roanoke, traveling in England and Ireland with his black manservant Johnny, wrote to a friend back home, "Much as I was prepared to see misery in the south of Ireland, I was utterly shocked at the condition of the poor peasantry between Limerick and Dublin. Why, sir, John never felt so proud of being a Virginia slave. He looked with horror upon the mud hovels and miser-able food of the white slaves, and I had no fear of his running away." Cunliffe, page 6. 14. Lest Americans imagine that such practices never darkened our shores, readers are referred to the documentary literature on white child labor in American factories, especially Markham, Lindsay, and Creel's Children in Bondage, Ruth Holland's Mill Child, and Lewis Hines, Photographs of Child Labor. By 1801, Samuel Slater's factory, one of the first built in America, employed over 100 children. The oldest was 10, the youngest was 4. Theophilus Fisk, a Connecticut publisher and Jackson Democrat, is ranked as one of the major leaders of the early U.S. labor movement. Fisk denounced wealthy white campaigners for Negro rights and in 1836 gave what has been described as a fierce anti-abolitionist speech in South Carolina. Fisk's anger derived from his observation that white slavery had been ignored. Fisk found that America's slaves had pale faces and, as abolitionism grew in Boston, called for an end to indulging sympathies for blacks in the South and for immediate emancipation of the white, factory, slaves of the North. Roediger, page 75. Charles Douglas, president of the New England Association of Farmers, Mechanics, and Other Working Men, described the 4,000 white children and women at work in the factories of Lowell, Massachusetts in the 1860s as dragging out a life of slavery and wretchedness. These establishments, New England's factories, are the present abode of wretchedness, disease, and misery. Ruth Holland, commenting on the participation of New England factory owners in the cause of abolitionism and rights for Negroes in the South, observed, "It's a little difficult to believe that Northern mill owners, who were mercilessly abusing white children for profit, felt such pure moral indignation at Negro slavery." Mill Child, page 28. Human brooms. Thousands of white children in Great Britain were forced to work as human brooms inside chimney flues and led miserable lives and died horrid deaths. The condition of these chimney sweepers reveals perhaps more than other form of white slavery, the attitude of the ruling class toward the most defenseless and oppressed segment of the surplus white poor. Chimney sweeping had been practiced as a trade as far back as the Tudor era, but the custom of forcing young boys to sweep flues with brushes and scrapers probably did not become general until the 18th century. British cities in the Georgian era were festooned with forests of rooftop brick and mortar. Several flues were usually installed in each of the chimneys of a Georgian mansion to satisfy the 18th century demand for more comfortable indoor heating, a fireplace in nearly every room being the new yardstick of comfort. As the number of flues increased, their size decreased, the average being approximately 10 by 14 inches. Children were essential for their maintenance. The very architecture of Georgian England now reflected the throwaway status of the white pauper child. Like the white children enslaved in the factories, they had been recruited from the workhouses as pauper apprentices. Parish officials tried to get rid of pauper children as soon as they were old enough by apprenticing them to any master who would take them. These included the masters of chimney sweeps, for whom thin, malnourished boys as young as 4 were considered ideal for their facility for entering narrow smoke channels. An 18th century eyewitness to the system of child chimney sweeps, Jonas Hanway, stated that it was equal to any of the miseries which human nature seems capable of supporting, and if the evil is suffered to reign any longer, it must level us with nations whom we call barbarians, if it does not ultimately draw down on us the vengeance of heaven. Improving the lot of the chimney sweeps, p. XXX, chimney sweeping was often little more than thinly disguised slavery. Inglis, page 30. It was not uncommon to send the children up the chimneys while they were still on fire, or to place flaming straw in the grate, beneath a child who had entered the chimney but refused to go all the way up. Skeletal deformities and crippling were common, as were fatal accidents. An eyewitness account. 15. Tells of a boy called to a job that needed to be done in haste. The child entered the flue but quickly came out again, saying it was too hot. The master told him to make as much haste as he could. He was a long time going up, heard him cry out he was hung to a nail, heard him crying and sobbing, very much, very near 9 o'clock, have ing been up about 20 minutes, never heard any more. Upon asking the boy's master, he sent another boy up after him. He went as far as he could reach his toes. The child said he could not pull him down. He won't come down, master, who said, damn him. The builder who extricated the boy said it was very difficult, as he was so wedged in, and the flue was so exceedingly hot. The flue was 14 inches by 12. That and the soot, and the heat, the builder testified, must have caused the boy's death by suffocation. Inglis, pages 136 to 137. Those boys who escaped death often contracted cancer. In 1775. Percival Pott observed in overwhelming number of young chimney sweeps suffering from scrotal cancer. He believed that the horrendous disease in these malnourished boys, kept thin by their employers to fit down the chimneys, was caused by their constant exposure to soot, but the English government took more than 50 years to pass laws to protect them. Mark Lapp, Chemical Deception, quoted in E! September-October, 1991, page 55. In handbills and advertisements, the masters of chimney sweeps would boast that they were in POS session of small boys for the best work inside flues. Little boys for small flues was a popular advertising slogan. An early 19th century investigation revealed that no child could be found who voluntarily entered the ranks of a sweep. They were all either orphans and indigents sold by the parish workhouses into servitude, or they had been kidnapped, or sold by famished parents to a master of sweeps. The boys of 10 had to be forced up the flues with slaps, kicks, beatings, and sometimes fire. On January 17, 1831, John Pacey, 10 years of age, was sent up a flue at the Omnibus Coffee House. It appears that the brickwork was decayed, and that when the boy had reached the top, the whole chimney gave way. The child was found with his skull crushed. March 1832, an 11-year-old boy was ordered by his master, D. Casey, to ascend a smoke-filled chimney. The boy was afraid to enter it. Casey, regardless of his natural apprehensions, beat him until he mounted. The lad suffocated to death. September 1st, 1832, Michael Bryan, apprentice chimney sweep to Philip Corbett, was engaged to sweep some chimneys in the house of George Barron, Esq. He arrived at Mr. Barron's about 7 o'clock, and the kitchen fire having been lighted before that hour, Corbett said it would not be necessary to put out the fire for the purpose of sweeping the chimney, as he would cover it with slack. Having covered the fire with slack, he desired the boy to ascend the chimney and commence operations. The boy immediately obeyed, but before he proceeded many yards, cried out that the chimney was too hot to advance further. The master desired him to rattle away, as the chimney was cool enough. The child continued to ascend with the greatest pain and difficulty. A tremendous blaze rushed up the chimney. The little sufferer succeeded in reaching the top of the chimney, and thence the roof of the house. A ladder was immediately procured, and the boy was brought down by Mr. Barron's servants. The appearance of the boy's body was truly distressing, having been dreadfully scorched and burned. He died about 12 hours later. October 10th, 1832. A chimney sweeper, named William Cakebread, between 6 and 7 years of age, was employed in sweeping an outbuilt flue at the back of the premises, number 36, Oxford Street, when, from the rottenness of the brickwork, the whole fell with a tremendous crash into the backyard, just as he had reached the top, and buried him underneath masses of the brickwork and rubbish. On being taken to the Middlesex Hospital, he survived only a few hours, when he expired in great agony. January 15th, 1834. A small boy was inside a chimney when it burst into flames. He was speedily conveyed to the hospital, where he remained some time in a state of excruciating agony and died. 16. In May 1839, a boy, William Wilson, was ordered to clean a flue that was still hot from a fire that had recently been extinguished. He was grievously burned and hospitalized 4 weeks, during which he was described by a caregiver as a meek, gentle, little creature. The tears started in his eyes when he was spoken kindly to. Society for Superseding the Necessity of Climbing Boys, The Trade of Chimney Sweeping, pages 2 to 20. There are many such cases on record, commensurate with the investigations arising from the founding of reform societies in the early 19th century, newspaper accounts, reports of humane societies, and parliamentary records contain hundreds of instances of climbing boys injured and killed, beaten and burned, deformed and diseased. George L. Phillips, England's Climbing Boys, page 4. Since conditions were even worse before the trade came under scrutiny, it is fair to surmise that hundreds of equally fatal or harrowing cases dating from the 18th century went unreported. It is no doubt difficult today to understand the rationale behind anyone sending a young child up a chimney while the fire was still lit in the grate. To grasp the mentality of the higher orders of the society of the time, it is necessary to appreciate the utter expendability of the lives of pauper white children as compared with the necessity of maintaining every luxury for the high-born. One observer, writing in the Edinburgh Review in 1819, stated, "We come now to burning little chimney sweepers. A large party is invited to dinner, a great display is to be made, and about an hour before dinner, there is an alarm that the kitchen chimney is on fire. It is impossible to put off the distinguished personages who are expected. It gets very late for the soup and fish. The cook is frantic, all eyes are turned upon the sable consolation of the chimney sweep, and up into the midst of the burning chimney is set one of the miserable infants of the brush. Bills proposed in Parliament requiring the abolition of the use of climbing boys under the age of 10 were defeated in the House of Lords in 1804, 1818, and twice in 1819. The Earl of Lauderdale argued against any restraint of the practices of the masters of the chimney sweeps, on the basis that children should be considered free agents for wage bargaining purposes. Lord Milton declared the idea of outlawing the use of young children in the chimneys overly hasty, since only very small children could possibly fit into the narrow flues. It would have required only a small expenditure by a homeowner to have the chimneys altered and widened to permit their cleaning by adults or machines, however. Lord Sidney Smith sneered at the humanitarian appeals for saving the lives of white children impressed into chimney sweeping. Humanity, observed Smith, is a modern invention. Lord Smith further stated that such a measure, for the reform of the chimney sweep trade, we are convinced from the evidence, could not be carried into execution without great injury to property. The Works of Sidney Smith, Volume 2, page 95. In the English Parliament, property rights were ruled paramount when legislation was proposed for preserving the lives and health of poor white children. Property rights were ruled to be of secondary consideration, however, when the cause of emancipating Negroes came to the fore. During this time, the atrocities visited upon the white children who climbed inside the chimneys of the wealthy was of little consequence compared with the massive attention given to the condition of the Negroes of America. When Parliament abolished Negro slavery in 1808, the flues of its august chambers were being climbed by boys 4, 5, and 6 years of age, sold to chimney sweepers for prices ranging from a few shillings to 2 guineas. The smaller the child, the better the price. George L. Phillips, page 3. David Ricardo, commenting upon the attempt to protect child laborers, wrote that the legislature must not be allowed to infringe on the rights of the owners of property. Inglis, page 166. Unless, of course, that property was a black slave, rather than a white one. Where the enslaved white children who served as human brooms came to the attention of the public at all, it was usually in terms of drollery and the picaresque. The English essayist Charles Lamb painted a rosy picture of their sufferings, celebrating them as a kind of charming, aesthetic prop, ad. 17. Lightful spectacle of almost clergy imps, decorating the roofs of London from their little pulpits, the tops of chimneys. In 1822, Charles Lamb's often quoted praise for chimney sweepers appeared in the London Magazine to bring a smile to the reader's face as he noted the author's kindly yearning toward these dim specks, poor blots. He could enjoy the whimsical scene of the shivering black-hued boy drink his morning dish of salop tea, to be amused by the little fellow, his poor red eyes, red from many a previous weeping, and soot-inflamed. Lamb, although successful in provoking a chuckle, did not attempt to bring a tear to the reader's eye. He might refer to the kibed heels, the early dawn working hours, the ragged and filthy clothes, the red-rimmed eyes, yet with the magic of romanticism he wove the facts of hardship and sorrow so deftly into the fanciful imagery that the misery of the boys is softened and lost sight of, as if chimney sweepers and climbing boys had been translated to the world of Restoration comedies. George L. Phillips, page 31, Inglis, page 167. The most striking illustration of this upper-class attitude of depraved indifference to the agony of poor white children can be seen in the case of Mrs. Elizabeth Montague, a very rich lady who took Lamb's whimsy to greater heights and, regarding herself as a patroness of London's penurious children, actually had extra chimneys constructed on her Sandalford Priory, so that climbing boys might have the pleasure of sweeping them and she the pleasure of observing the children's sport. George L. Phillips, page 31. The lives of poor white children continued to be sacrificed even when machine cleaning became feasible without alterations of any kind being made to flues. In 1828, Joseph Glass improved the design of a chimney cleaning machine invented earlier by George Smart. The new modifications rendered the cleaning of every flue by means of the contrivance an inexpensive and efficient means of foregoing child labor for the purpose. The device was mostly ignored by the masters of sweeps and homeowners alike because English boys cost even less than the affordable cleaning machine. The cost of glass machine with a ball and brush amounted to £4, yet sweeps preferred boys whom they could easily obtain in almshouses or on the streets. They made the boys beg their food, so the upkeep was almost nothing. Whereas the machine was liable to wear and tear, the child was forced to work, often when he was ill. Moreover, the machine required the combined efforts of a master and journeyman. The child swept the chimney unaided. George L. Phillips, page 34. Is it possible, asked the reformer J.C. Hudson, that women, whose love of infants is said to be so strong, can persist in employing little children for this purpose? The answer was yes. Samuel Roberts, in an 1834 essay on the boys used as chimney sweeps, addressed his indignation toward the upper-class British females who met in their sumptuously appointed parlors to weep with tender-hearted solicitude over the latest accounts from America of oppression to Negroes, while in the next room, scarred and burned 5-year-old English boys enslaved as human grooms were being forced up the ladies' chimney without a thought for their welfare. There is a race of human beings in this country, the chimney sweepers climbing boys, which is more oppressed than the Negroes in either the West Indian Islands or in North America. These objects are all young and helpless. Their employment is tenfold more horrible than that of any attached ing to the Negro slaves. A far greater number of them are crippled and rendered deformed for life. A far greater proportion of them die in consequence of hard usage, while the horrible deaths from suffocation, burning, and other accidents are in this case beyond measure more numerous. And all this at home, within our knowledge, before our eyes, in our very houses. How many of these poor infants arrive at years of maturity? Of those who die young, who knows or cares anything about them? The death of any of your favorite dogs would be more lamented. An address to British females, pages 11 to 17. 18. Breaking the chains of illusion. Historian Oscar Handlin writes that in colonial America, white servants could be bartered for a profit, sold to the highest bidder for the unpaid debts of their masters, and otherwise transferred like movable goods or chattels. In every civic, social, and legal attribute, these victims of the turbulent displacements of the 16th and 17th centuries were set apart. Despised by every other order, without apparent means of rising to a more favored place, these men and their children, and their children's children seemed mired in a hard, degraded life. The condition of the first Negroes in the continental English colonies must be viewed within the perspective of these conceptions and realities of white servitude. Origins of the Southern Labor System, William and Mary Quarterly, April, 1950, page 202. The history of enslavement in America, as portrayed in the tunnel vision of the corporate media, has focused exclusively on the enslavement of Negroes. The impression is given that only whites bear responsibility for enslaving Negroes and only Negroes were slaves. In fact, Negroes in Africa, as well as American Indian tribes such as the Cherokee, engaged in extensive enslavement of Negroes. The Cherokee Indians owned large plantations on which they worked their Negro slaves in gangs. Are Hal Liberton, Jr., Red Over Black, Black Slavery Among the Cherokee Indians, page 20. White slaves were actually owned by Negroes and Indians in the South to such an extent that the Virginia Assembly passed the following law in 1670. it is enacted that no Negro or Indian, though baptized and enjoined their own freedom, shall be capable of any such purchase of Christians. Statutes of the Virginia Assembly, Volume 2, pages 280 to 81. Negroes also owned other Negroes in America. Charleston County Probate Court Records, 1754-1758, page 406. While whites languished in chains, blacks were free men in Virginia throughout the 17th century. Willie Lee Rose, A Documentary History of Slavery in North America, page 15. John Henderson Russell, Free Negro in Virginia, 1619 to 1865, page 23. Bruce Levine, et al., Who Built America, Volume 1, page 52. In 1717, it was proposed that a qualification for election to the South Carolina Assembly was to be the ownership of one white man. Journals of the Commons House of Assembly of the Province of South Carolina, 1692 to 1775, Volume 5, pages 294 to 295. Negroes voted in the Carolina counties of Berkeley and Craven in 1706, and their votes were taken. Levine, page 63. Blacks were toting guns or other weapons and going about armed in the service of wealthy landowners at the same time that tens of thousands of enslaved white men were forbidden arms. In 1678, 1,000 Negroes were armed by the planters and formed into a fighting militia for protection against the French, Carl and Roberta Bridenbaugh. No peace beyond the line. The English in the Caribbean, 1624 to 1690, pages 359 to 360. In Carolina in 1704, 1707, 1712, 1738, and 1741 bills were passed authorizing armed Negro militias in the service of the planters. In 1742, certificates were presented to the black militiamen for services rendered. Warren B. Smith, White Servitude in Colonial South Carolina, page 98. During the American Revolution, Lord Dunmore, the royal governor of Virginia appointed by the king, sought to win Virginia back for the British crown with black troops recruited in America to be called the Ethiopian Regiment. Parties of blacks in the South were armed by the British with guns, clubs, and swords with the order to use them against rebellious American patriots. Ronald Hoffman, The Disaffected in the Revolutionary South, The American Revolution, Explorations in the History of American Radicalism, pages 281 to 282. By the 1st of December, 1775, nearly 300 blacks in uniform, with the words "Liberty to Slaves" inscribed across their breasts, were members of Lord Dunmore's Ethiopian Regiment. On the 9th of December, at the Battle of Great Bridge, the Lexington of the South, the British force of 600, nearly half black, was thrown back by Woodford's all-white American 2nd Virginia Regiment. 19. In April 1782, General Nathanael Greene informed Washington that the British had armed and put into uniform at least 700 blacks. The Ethiopian Regiment was not the only black unit. That same spring, 2 members of a black British cavalry troop, about 100 strong, were killed in a skirmish with Patriots at Dorchester, Virginia. Evacuating Boston, the Royal Army sailed to Halifax with a company of Negroes. It is possible that tens of thousands of black slaves in South Carolina and Georgia went over to the British. Sidney Kaplan, The Black Presence in the Era of the American Revolution, 1770 to 1800, pages 32, 61, and 67. During the War of 1812, the British ranks included approximately 300 armed American Negroes, who were used in combat against American forces. Some of these Negroes helped the British burn the White House in 1814, Roediger, page 44.3. Note wonder that Frederick Douglass would declare to a white audience on Independence Day, 9 years before the Civil War, "This 4th of July is yours, not mine." The British aristocracy's penchant for arming Negroes and Indians for combat against white Americans has largely been forgotten today, even though it was one of the factors which led the colonists to go to war against King George, and was cited as such in the Declaration of Independence. The patriots' outrage at Indian atrocities and anger at Dunmore's manumission of Negroes was summarized by Jefferson in one of the least quoted passages of the Declaration. He, King George, has excited domestic insurrections amongst us, Dunmore's proclamation freeing blacks in American jurisdiction, and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. Poor whites and the Southern Confederacy. Even if they attained their freedom, dirt poor whites were forced to compete against Negro slave labor jobs were few, and Southern planters sat idly as poor whites died of malnutrition for want of food and medicine. Negro slaves were expensive. To protect their investments, white aristocrats usually treated their Negro slaves well, providing for adequate food, clothing, and medication even as poor whites in the same town sickened and died from disease and malnutrition. Try to envision the 19th century scene: yeoman Southern whites, sick and destitute, watching their children dying while enduring the spectacle of Negroes from the jungles of Africa healthy and well-fed thanks to the ministrations of their fabulously wealthy white owners who cared little or nothing for the local white trash. In the course of an 1855 journey up the Alabama River on the steamboat fashion, Frederick Law Olmsted, the landscape architect who designed New York's Central Park, observed bales of cotton being thrown from a considerable height into a cargo ship's hold. The men tossing the bales somewhat recklessly into the hold were Negroes. The men in the hold were Irish. Olmsted inquired about this to a mate on the ship. "Oh," said the mate, "the niggers are worth too much to be risked here. If the paddies are knocked overboard or get their backs broke, nobody loses anything." Frederick Law Olmsted, A Journey to the Seaboard Slave States, pages 100 to 101, Gem de Ste. Croix, Slavery and Other Forms of Unfree Labor, page 27. In the antebellum South, gangs of Irish immigrants worked ditching and draining plantations, build levees, and sometimes clearing land because of the danger to valuable Negro slave property. George Templeton Strong, a Whig patrician diarist, considered Irish workmen at his home to have had prehensile paws rather than hands. He denounced the Celtic beast. Irish youths were sometimes called Irish slaves and more frequently bound boys. A common joke in the South in the A few blacks fought on the side of the Americans during the Revolution, including some Massachusetts Negroes known as the Bucks of America. The claim has long been made that the first victim of the British in the American Revolution was a black, Crispus Attucks. In fact, Attucks was an Indian, a descendant of John Attucks, a Natick who had battled American pioneers in King Philip's War. 20. Civil War period was that when blacks were ordered to work hard, they complained that their masters were treating them like Irishmen. Roediger, pages 133, 146,150.4. When I was a boy, recalled Waters McIntosh, who had been a slave in Sumter, South Carolina, we used to sing, "Rather be a nigger than a poor white man." Even in slavery, we used to sing that. Mr. McIntosh's remarks reveal that the poor whites of the South ranked below blacks in social standing. Slaves felt unbridled contempt for lower-class whites. Frederick Douglass opened his F.A. Mau's Life and Times with an account of Talbot County, Maryland, which he said housed a white population of the lowest order. Throughout the South, the slaves of many of the larger planters lived in a society of blacks and well-to-do whites, and were encouraged to view even respectable laboring whites with disdain. Ella Kelly, who had been a slave in South Carolina. You know, boss, these days dear is three kind of people. Lowest down is a layer of white folks, then in the middle is a layer of colored folks, and on top is the cream, a layer of good white folks. The slaves noticed their master's sense of superiority toward marginal farmers as well as toward poor whites and, by associating themselves with the quality white folks, strengthened their self-esteem. A slave expressed no surprise that his master, who was Big Buckra, never associated with white trash. And Rosa Stark, who had been owned by a big planter in South Carolina, reported that poor whites had to use the kitchen door when they went up to the big house. Her mistress had a grand manner, no patience with poor white folks. The many Negro ex-slaves who recalled the lot of the small farmers and poor whites as hard and even as bad as their own knew what they were talking about. The slaves saw enough abject poverty, disease, and demoralization among the poor whites to see their own condition under Ole Mass's protection as perhaps not the worst of evils. Eugene D. Genovese, rather be a nigger than a poor white man. Slave Perceptions of Southern Yeomen and Poor Whites, in Toward a New View of America, pages 79, 81 to 82, 84, 90 to 91. This situation engendered a rage in the descendants and survivors of white slavery, which has seldom been accounted for in the history of white working class support for the Northern abolitionist cause. We can gauge the attitude of yeoman whites, especially in the border states like Kentucky and Tennessee, but throughout the USA as well, who were either neutral during the Confederacy's struggle or sided with Lincoln, from the statement of an Iowa congressman who maintained that it was the planter aristocracy which exalts and spreads Africans at the expense of the white race. Emma Lou Thornbrough, The Race Issue in Indiana Politics During the Civil War, Indiana Magazine of History, June, 1951. Some of the leaders of the Free Soil Party and many of the Unionist soldiers who made up the ranks of Lincoln's armies in southern Ohio, western North Carolina, eastern Tennessee, southern Illinois, Kentucky, and elsewhere were survivors of white slavery or descendants of white slaves. They did not view themselves as advocates of what was then referred to as racial amalgamation. 2. For Strong's opinion was hardly unanimous. In the 1850s, Massachusetts legislator Caleb Cushing announced that he admitted to an equality with me, sir, the white man, my blood and race, whether he be a Saxon of England or a Celt of Ireland, but I do not admit as my equals either the red man of America, or the yellow man of Asia, or the black of Africa. Irish Americans were among the foremost fighters for the rights of white workers and for separation of the races. The term miscegenation, from the Latin miscere, to mix and genus, for race, was coined by two Irishmen, George Wakeman and D.G. Crowley, in their anonymously written 1863 anti-integration satire, Miscegenation, the Theory of the Blending of the Races. The Englishman James D. Byrne observed that it is in the Irish residents that they, American Negroes, have, and will continue to have, their most formidable enemies. 3 years among the working classes in the U.S. During the Civil War, page 14. 21. Historically, they regarded themselves as separatists and viewed the Southern planters' desire to spread Negroes into California, Oregon, and other territories as a grave threat to free white labor and the Old Testament principle of racial separation. Nehemiah 13 verses 23 to 27, Ezra 10 verses 10 to 14, Hosea 5 verse 7. Congressman David Wilmot sponsored a law to ban black slavery in the American West. He dubbed his proposed law the white man's proviso. He was bitterly opposed by the Southern elite. Wilmot told Congress that he intended to preserve America's western frontier for the sons of toil, my own race and color. Charles B. Going, David Wilmot, Free Soiler, page 174. During much of the Civil War, the political and military leaders of the Confederacy could not travel in certain parts of the Deep South without armed escorts. Jeffrey Rogers Hummel, The Civil War, The United States at War Audio Classic Series, Part 2. For fear of attack from upcountry Southern whites who hated the planter aristocracy and the war they saw as being for the sole benefit of the expansion of the planters' infernal Negroes. Upcountry Southern whites consisted in large part of the survivors and the children of the survivors of white slavery who resided in the hills, mountains, and Piedmont regions of the South under frontier conditions. In the antebellum 19th century South, a large number of white Southerners lived in the upcountry, an area of small farmers and herdsmen, engaged largely in mixed and subsistence agriculture. Lit-tle currency circulated, barter was common, and upcountry families dressed in homespun cloth, the product of the spinning wheel and the handloom. This economic order gave rise to a distinctive subculture that celebrated mutuality, egalitarianism for whites, and independence. Mountain counties rejected secession from the outset. One citizen of Winston County in the northern Alabama Hill Country believed yeomen had no business fighting for a planter-dominated aristocracy. All they want is to get you to fight for their infernal Negroes, and after you do their fightin', you may kiss their hind parts for the care. Eric Foner, Reconstruction, America's Unfinished Revolution, 1863 to 1877, pages 11 and 13. Poor whites had to be drafted into the Confederate Army. As in the North, where resistance to conscription was widespread, many Southern whites saw the conflict as a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. Indeed, any slaveholder owning 20 or more black slaves was exempt from military combat. From 1609 until the early 1800s, between 1/2 and 2/3 of all the white colonists who came to the New World came as slaves. Of the passengers on the Mayflower, 12 were white slaves. John Van Der Zee, Bound Over, page 93. White slaves cleared the forests, drained the swamps, built the roads. They worked and died in greater numbers than anyone else. Both psychologically and materially, whites in modern times are called upon to bear burdens of guilt and monetary reparation for Negro slavery. This position is based entirely on enforced ignorance and the deliberate suppression of the record of white slavery in North America. Hundreds of thousands of whites had been enslaved during the colonial era in America, while millions of others were too poor to afford even a mule, much less a black slave. Slave reparations and guilty feelings are due, if one subscribes to such a thing as retroactive collective guilt, from the descendants of the minority of wealthy whites who owned Negro slaves and who, in the South at least, were themselves generally reduced to penury in the aftermath of the Civil War. Reparations would also have to be paid by the descendants of the Cherokee and other American Indian tribes who owned black slaves, and by the heirs of black tribal leaders in Africa who sold them into slavery. 3. Reparations must also be paid, if the logic of the situation is to be consistent, to the modern-day white descendants of the white slaves of early America. The whole discussion of Negro slavery, Southern racism, and the Civil War as currently framed by the establishment agenda necessarily must exclude any examination of the fact of white slavery, especially in the 17th and 18th centuries, and the condition of free white poor in the 19th century forced to compete against Negro slave labor in the South. 22. Whites were the first slaves in America. The enslavement of whites extended throughout the American colonies, and white slave labor was a crucial factor in the economic development of the colonies. Gradually, it developed into a fixed system every bit as rigid and codified as Negro slavery was to become. In fact, Negro slavery was efficiently established in colonial America because black slaves were governed, organized, and controlled by the structures and organization that were first used to enslave and control whites. Black slaves were late corners fitted into a system already developed. Ulrich B. Phillips, Life and Labor in the Old South, pages 25 to 26. White slavery was the historic base upon which Negro slavery was constructed. The important structures, labor ideologies, and social relations necessary for slavery already had been established within indentured servitude. White servitude, in many ways, came remarkably close to the ideal type of chattel slavery, which later became associated with the African experience. Hilary McD. Beck. Less, White Servitude, pages 6 to 7 and 71. The practice developed and tolerated in the kidnapping of whites laid the foundation for the kidnapping of Negroes. Eric Williams, From Columbus to Castro, page 103. The official papers of the white slave trade refer to adult white slaves as freight, and white child slaves were termed half-freight. Like any other commodity on the shipping inventories, white human beings were seen strictly in terms of market economics by merchants. The American colonies prospered through the use of white slaves, which Virginia planter John Corey Delcard in 1619 were our principal wealth. The white servant, a semi-slave, was more important in the 17th century than even the Negro slave, in respect to both numbers and economic significance. Marcus W. Jernigan, Laboring in Dependent Classes in Colonial America, page 45. Where mainstream history books or films touch on white slavery, it is referred to with the deceptively mild-sounding title of indentured servitude, the implication being that the enslavement of whites was not as terrible or all-encompassing as Negro slavery, but constituted instead a more benign bondage, that of servitude. Yet the terms servant and slave were often used interchangeably to refer to people whose status was clearly that of permanent, lifetime enslavement. An account of the English sugar plantations, sit, in the British Museum, Stowe manuscript, written circa 1660 to 1685, refers to black and white slaves as servants. The colonies were plentifully supplied with Negro and Christian servants, which are the nerves and sinews of a plantation. Christian was a euphemism for white. In the North American colonies in the 17th and 18th centuries, and subsequently in the United States, servant was the usual designation for a slave. Compact edition of the Oxford English Dictionary, p. 2739. The use of the word servant to describe a slave would have been very prevalent among a Bible-literate people like colonial Americans. In all English translations of the Bible available at the time, from Wycliffe's to the 1611 King James Version, the word slave as it appeared in the original biblical languages was translated as servant. For example, the King James Version of Genesis 9 verse 25 is rendered, "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be." The intended meaning here is clearly that of slave, and there is little doubt that in the mind of early Americans the word servant was synonymous with slave. Cf. Genesis 9 verse 25 in the New International Version Bible. In original documents of the white merchants who transported Negroes from Africa, the blacks were called servants. One notes that the company of royal adventurers referred to their cargo as negers, Negro servants, servants, from Africa. Handlin, page 205. The documentary record debunks the propaganda that slavery was strictly a racist operation, part of a conspiracy of white supremacy, because 1. Whites as well as blacks were enslaved. 2. In the 17th century, slaves of both races were called servants. 3. The colonial merchants of 17th century America had no qualms about enslaving their own white kindred. Oscar Handlin. 23. Through the first 3/4 of the 17th century, the Negroes, even in the South, were not numerous. They came into a society in which a large part of the white population was to some degree unfree. The Negroes' lack of freedom was not unusual. These black newcomers, like so many others, were accepted, bought, and held as kinds of servants. It was in this sense that Negro servants were sometimes called slaves. For that matter, it also applied to white Englishmen. In New England and New York, too, there had early been an intense desire for cheap, unfree hands, for bond slavery, villanage, or captivity, whether it be white, Negro, or Indian. Handlin, pages 202 to 203, 204, 218. The early laws against runaways, against drunkenness, against carrying arms or trading without permission had applied penalties as heavy as death to all servants, Negroes and whites. Handlin, p. 214. A survey of the various ad hoc codes and regulations devised in the 17th century for the governing of those in bondage reveals no special category for black slaves. Henning, Volume 1, pages 226, 258, 540. During Lagon's time in Barbados, 1647 to 1650, white indentured female servants worked in the field gangs alongside the small but rapidly growing number of enslaved black women. In this formative stage of the Sugar Revolution, planters did not attempt to formulate a division of labor along racial lines. White indentured servants were not perceived by their masters as worthy of special treatment in the labor regime. Beckles, Natural Rebels, page 29. Whiteness and independence were not firmly connected, nor was blackness yet fully linked with servitude. Roediger, page 27. The contemporary academic consensus on slavery in America represents history by retroactive fiat, decreeing that conclusions about the entire epoch fit the characterizations of its final stage, the 19th century Southern plantation system. 4. 17th century colonial slavery and 19th century American slavery are not a seamless garment. Historians who pretend otherwise have to maintain several fallacies, the chief among these being the supposition that when white servants constituted the majority of serval laborers in the colonial period, they worked in privileged or even luxurious conditions which were forbidden to blacks. In truth, white slaves were often restricted to doing the dirty, backbreaking field work, while blacks and even Indians were taken into the plantation mansion houses to work as domestics. Contemporaries were aware that the popular stereotyping of white, female indentured servants as whores, sluts, and debauched wenches discouraged their use in elite planter households. Many pioneer planters preferred to employ Amerindian women in their households. With the establishment of an elitist social culture, there was a tendency to reject white, indentured servants as domestics. Black women represented a more attractive option and, as a result, were widely employed as domestics in the second half of the 17th century. In 167-5, for example, John Blake, who had recently arrived on the island of Barbados, informed his brother in Ireland that his white indentured servant was a slut and he would like to be rid of her in favor of a nigger wench. Beckles, Natural Rebels, pages 56 to 57. In the 17th century, white slaves were cheaper to acquire than Negroes and therefore were often mistreated to a greater extent. Having paid a bigger price for the Negro, the planters treated the black better than they did their Christian white servant. Even the Negroes recognized this and did not hesitate to show their contempt for those white men who, they could see, were worse off than themselves. Bridenbaugh, p. 118. It was white slaves who built America from its very beginnings and made up the overwhelming majority of slave laborers in the colonies in the 17th century. Negro slaves seldom had to do the kind of virtually lethal work the white slaves of America did in the formative years of settlement. The frontier demands for heavy manual labor, such as felling trees, soil clearance, and general infrastructural development, had been satisfied primarily by white indentured servants between 1627 and 1643. Beckless, Natural Rebels, page 8. 24. The merchant class of early America was an equal opportunity enslaver and viewed with enthusiasm the bondage of all poor people within their grasp, including their own white kinsmen. There was a precedent for this in the English legal concept of villenage, a form of medieval white slavery in England. As late as 1669, those who thought of large-scale agriculture assumed it would be manned not by Negroes, but by several whites under a condition of villenage. John Locke's constitutions for South Carolina envisaged an hereditary group of servile leetmen, and Lord Shaftesbury's seigneury on Lock Island in 1674 actually attempted to put the scheme into practice. Handlin, page 207. The Random House Dictionary of the English Language defines servitude as slavery or bondage of any kind. The dictionary defines bondage as being bound by or subjected to external control. It defines slavery as ownership of a person or persons by another or others. Hundreds of thousands of whites in colonial America were owned outright by their masters and died in slavery. They had no control over their own lives and were auctioned on the block and examined like livestock, exactly like black slaves, with the exception that these whites were enslaved by their own race. White slaves found themselves powerless as individuals, without honor or respect, and driven into commodity production not by any inner sense of moral duty, but by the outer stimulus of the whip. Beckles, White Servitude, page 5. Upon arrival in America, white slaves were put up for sale by the ship captains or merchants. Families were often separated under these circumstances when wives and offspring were auctioned off to the highest bidder. Foster R. Dulles, Labor in America, A History, page 7. Eleanor Bradbury, sold with her 3 sons to a Maryland owner, was separated from her husband, who was bought by a man in Pennsylvania. Van der Zee, page 165. White people who were passed over for purchase at the point of entry were taken into the back country by sole drivers who herded them along like cattle to a Smithfield market and then put them up for auction at public fairs. Prospective buyers felt their muscles, checked their teeth, like cattle. Sharon Salinger, To Serve Well and Faithfully, Labor and Indentured Servants in Pennsylvania, 1682 to 1800, page 97. Indentured servants were sold at auction, sometimes after being stripped knockhead. Roediger, page 30. We were exposed to sale in public fairs as so many brute beasts. Ekirch, page 129. Contemporary accounts likened them to livestock auctions. They are brought in here, a person noted, and sold in the same manner as horses or cows in our market or fair. William Green recalled, they search us there as the dealers in horses do those animals in this country, by looking at our teeth, viewing our limbs. William Green, Sufferings of William Green, page 6 in Ekirch, page 123. They are frequently hurried in droves, under the custody of severe brutal drivers, into the back country to be disposed of as servants. Jernigan, page 225. Those whites for whom no buyer could be found even after marketing them inland, were returned to the slave trader to be sold for a pittance. These whites were officially referred to as refuse and lumps. Unloading large numbers wholesale, called lumping, was generally a last resort that yielded smaller rewards. White slaver James Cheston wrote to his partners, "The servants go off slower than I expected. I shall try them a few days longer in the retail way and then lump the remainder." Large-scale purchasers generally retailed servants farther inland. "They drive them through the country like a parcel of sheep until they can sell them to advantage," wrote white slave John Harrower. The Virginia Company arranged with the City of London to have 100 poor white children out of the swarms that swarm in the place sent to Virginia in 1619 for sale to the wealthy planters of the colony to be used as slave labor. The Privy Council of London authorized the Virginia Company to imprison, punish, and dispose of any of those children upon any disorder by them committed, as cause shall require. Emphasis supplied. 25. The trade in white slaves was a natural one for English merchants who imported sugar and tobacco from the colonies. Whites kidnapped in Britain could be exchanged directly for this produce. The trade in white slaves was basically a return haul operation. The operations of Captain Henry Brain were typical. In November of 1670, Captain Brain was ordered to sail from Carolina with a consignment of timber for sale in the West Indies. From there, he was to set sail for London with a load of sugar purchased with the profits from the sale of the timber. In England, he was to sell the sugar and fill his ship with from 200 to 300 white slaves to be sold in Carolina. The notion of a contract and of the legal status of the white in servitude became a fiction as a result of the exigencies of the occasion. In 1623, George Sandys, the treasurer of Virginia, was forced to sell the only remaining 11 white slaves of his company for lack of provisions to support them. 7 of these white people were sold for 150 pounds of tobacco. The slave status of whites held in colonial bondage can also be seen by studying the disposition of the estates of the wealthy whites. Whites in bondage were rated as inventories and disposed of by will and by deed along with the rest of the property. They were bought, sold, bartered, gambled away, mortgaged, weighed on scales like farm animals and taxed as property. Richard Ligon, a contemporary eyewitness to white slavery, in his 1657 A True and Exact History tells of a white slave, a woman, who was being traded by her master for a pig. Both the pig and the white woman were weighed on a scale. The price was set for a groat a pound for the hog's flesh and 6 pence for the woman's flesh. Page 59. In general, whites were not treated with the relative dignity the term indentured servants connotes, but as degraded chattel, part of the personal estate of the master and on a par with his farm animals. The term indentured servitude, therefore, is nothing more than a propagandistic softening of the historic experience of enslaved white people in order to make a false distinction between their sufferings and those of Negro slaves. This is not to deny the existence of a fortunate class of whites who could in fact be called indentured servants according to the modern conception of the term, who worked under privileged conditions of limited bondage for a specific period of time, primarily as apprentices. These lucky few were given religious instruction and could sue in a court of law. They were employed in return for their transportation to America and room and board during their period of service. But certain historians pretend that this apprentice system, the privileged form of bound labor, was representative of the entire experience of white bondage in America. In actuality, the indentured apprentice system represented the condition of only a tiny segment of the whites in bondage in early America. Strictly speaking, the term indented servant should apply only to those persons who had bound themselves voluntarily to service, but it is generally used for all classes of bond servants. Oliver P. Chitwood, A History of Colonial America, page 341. Richard B. Morris in Government and Labor in Early America notes that, in the colonies, however, apprenticeship was merely a highly specialized and favored form of bound labor. The more comprehensive colonial institution included all persons bound to labor for periods of years as determined either by agreement or by law, both minors and adults, and Indians and Negroes as well as whites, p. 310. In a reversal of our contemporary ideas about white indenture and black slavery, many blacks in colonial America were often temporary bondsmen freed after a period of time. Peter Hancock A.R. arranged for a Negro servant named Asha to serve for 12 months, thenceforth to be a free person. Rittenbough, pages 120 to 121. Black indentured servants in the 18th century even had an education clause in their contracts. Free Negro boys bound out as apprentices were sometimes given the benefit of an educational clause in the indenture. Two such cases occur in the Princess and County records, one in 1719, 2. 26. Learn the trade of tanner, the master to teach him to read, and the other, in 1727, to learn the trade of gunsmith, the master to teach him to read the Bible distinctly. Jernigan, page 162. Newspaper and court records in South Carolina cite a free Negro fellow named Johnny Holmes, lately an indented servant with Nicholas Trott, and a Negro man commonly called Jack Cutler. He is a free Negro, having faithfully served out his time with me 4 years according to the contract agreed upon. Warren B. Smith, page 106. David W. Gallen's son is the author of an Orwellian suppression of the horrors and conditions of white slavery entitled White Servitude in Colonial America. He states concerning white slaves, European men and women could exercise choice both in deciding whether to migrate to the colonies and in choosing possible destinations. This is positively misleading. At the bare minimum, hundreds of thousands of white slaves were kidnapped off the streets and roads of Great Britain in the course of more than 150 years and sold to captains of slave ships in London known as White Guineamen. 10,000 whites were kidnapped from England in the year 1670 alone. Edward Channing, His Tory of the United States, Volume 2, page 369. The very word kidnapper was first coined in Britain in the 1600s to describe those who captured and sold white children into slavery, kidnappers. Another whitewash is the heralded classic work on the subject, Abbott Emerson Smith's Colonists. In Bondage, which is one long cover-up of the extent of the kidnapping, the denial of the existence of white slavery, and numerous other apologies for the establishment, including a cover-up of the deportation and enslavement of the Irish people. But the record proves otherwise. For more on Abbott Emerson Smith's errors, cf. Warren B. Smith, White Servitude in Colonial South Carolina, page 9. Irish slaves. Cromwell's conquest of Ireland in the middle of the 17th century made slaves as well as subjects of the Irish people. Over 100,000 men, women, and children were seized by the English troops and shipped to the West Indies, where they were sold into slavery. George Novak, Slavery in Colonial America, America's Revolutionary Heritage, page 142. On September 11, 1655 came the following decree from the Puritan Protectorate by Henry Cromwell in London, concerning the young Irish women. Although we must use force in taking them up, yet it being so much for their own good, and likely to be of so great advantage to the public, it is not in the least doubted, that you may have such number of them as you think fit to make use upon this AC count. The account was enslavement and transportation to the colonies. A week later, Henry Cromwell ordered that 1,500 Irish boys aged 12 to 14 also be shipped into slavery with the Irish girls in the steaming tropics of Jamaica and Barbados in circumstances which killed off white adult slaves by the thousands due to the rigors of field work in that climate and the savage brutality of their overseers. In October, the Council approved the plan. Altogether, more than 100,000 Irish were shipped to the West Indies, where they died in slavery in horrible conditions. Children weren't the only victims. Even 80-year-old Irish women were deported to the West Indies and enslaved. Dr. Essen, The Curse of Cromwell, A History of the Ironside Conquest of Ireland, 1649-53, page 176. Irish religious leaders were herded into internment camps throughout Ireland, and were then moved progressively to the ports for shipment overseas like cattle. Dr. Essen, page 159. By the time Cromwell's men had finished with the Irish people, only 1/6 of the Irish population remained on their lands. Essen, page 168. Protestant slaves. Cromwell did not only enslave Catholics. Poor white Protestants on the English mainland fared no better. In February 1656, he ordered his soldiers to find 1,200 poor English women for enslavement. 27. And deportation to the colonies. In March, he repeated the order but increased the quota to 2,000 young women of England. In the same year, Cromwell's Council of State ordered all the homeless poor of Scotland, male and female, transported to Jamaica for enslavement. Eric Williams, page 101. Of course, Cromwell and the Puritan ruling class were not the only ones involved in the enslavement of whites. During the Restoration reign of King Charles II, the monarch with Catholic sympathies heirs who had been Cromwell's archenemy, the king enslaved large groups of poor Presbyterians and Scottish Covenanters and deported them to the plantations in turn. Legislation sponsored by King Charles II in 1686, intended to ensure the enslavement of Protestant rebels in the Caribbean colonies, was so harsh that one observer noted, the condition of these rebels was by this act made as bad, if not worse than the Negroes. Richard Hall, Acts Passed in the Island of Barbados, page 484. By far the largest number and certainly the most important group of white indentured servants were the poor Protestants from Europe. Warren B. Smith, page 44. Legal basis and definitions. In the late 16th century, the English Parliament empowered magistrates to enslave the British poor beyond the seas. In 1615, James I gave similar authorization. The operation was formalized with the passage of the Transportation Act of 1718, the preamble of which declared that its purpose was both to deter criminals and to supply the colonies with labor. Since in many of His Majesty's colonies and plantations in America there is a great want of servants. A.G.L. Shaw, Convicts and the Colorado Niece, page 25. One of the earliest advocates of the enslavement of indigent whites for labor in Nova Britannia was the Elizabethan preacher and geographer Richard Hakluyt, who advised the Crown that poor whites should be condemned for certain years in the western parts of the New World, where they would be raised again, and do their country good service by performing such useful chores as felling timber, mining precious minerals, and raising sugar cane. Richard Hakluyt, A Discourse Concerning Western Planting, Dean edition, page 37, A. Roger Kirch, Bound for America, page 7. Hakluyt was among the first to label the new British poor criminals and to urge their utilization as slave laborers in America, a process which would later become known under the euphemism transportation. A. L. Rouse, The Elizabethans and America, page 46. Confronted with the labor shortage typical in early America, the colony of New York petitioned for white slaves from England in 1693. The Quakers of Philadelphia also sought them. Shaw, pages 32-34. There were four categories of status for white people in colonial America: white freemen who owned property, white apprentices, also called indentured servants, redemptioners and freewillers, and white slaves. The attempt by Abbott Emerson Smith, Galen Son, and many others to deny the existence and brutal treatment of white slaves by pretending they were mostly just indentured servants learning a trade, regulated according to venerable, medieval guild traditions of apprenticeship, runs completely counter to the documentary record. The planters did not conceive of their white servants socially and emotionally as integral parts of the family or household, but instead viewed them as an alien commodity. Having abandoned the moral responsibility aspect of pre-capitalist ideology, masters enforced an often violent social domination of white servants by the manipulation of oppressive legal codes, transform indentured servitude, with its pre-industrial, moral, paternalistic superstructure, into a market system of brutal servitude, maintained by the systematic application of legally sanctioned force and violence. Beck Less, White Servitude, pages 14 and 5. In formal British and colonial custom validated the kidnapping of working-class British whites and their enslavement in the colonies under such euphemisms as servitude according to the custom, which upheld the force of verbal contracts which shipmasters and press gangs claimed existed. B. 28. Between them and the wretched whites, they kidnapped off the streets of England and sold into colonial slavery. These justifications for white slavery arose in law determined by penal codes. In other words, white slavery was permitted and perpetuated on the claim that all who were thus enslaved were criminals. No proof for this claim was needed because the fact of one's enslavement proved the fact of one's criminality. The history of white slavery in the New World can be found within the history of the enforcement of the penal codes in Britain and America. The convicts, once in America, encountered widespread exploitation. Tobacco planters felt few qualms about putting freeborn Englishmen to hard labor or, if need be, shackling them in chains. Neither the status of convicts as servants nor their living conditions were altogether different from those of slaves, and opportunities for achieving a settled social life were arguably worse. Ikirch, pages 3-4. Punctilious gentlemen disdain that Englishmen should be slaves on English land, a correspondent in the Gentleman's Magazine pointed out, and rather choose America for the theater of our shame. Ikirch, page 21. The claim of the aristocracy that these convicts were mainly dangerous criminals and felons guilty of heinous crimes was largely a function of the propaganda that attended the enterprise of white slavery in the early American era. The great bulk of offenses were committed, not by professional thieves, but by the needy poor. Due to what one witness, the clergyman Francis Hare, described as the extreme misery and poverty great numbers are reduced to. Ikirch, page 13. Slaves were made of poor white criminals who had poached a deer, stolen a loaf of bread, or had been convicted of destroying shrubbery in an aristocrat's garden. In 1655, 4 teenagers were whipped through the streets of Edinburgh, Scotland, burned behind the ears, and Barbados into slavery in the colonies for interrupting a minister, James Scott, while he was preaching in church. Calendar of State Papers, Colonial Series, America and West Indies, Volume 5. Under British law in the 17th and 18th centuries, felonies punishable by death included stealing or vandalizing gates, fruits, canal banks, and hop vines. Other capital crimes included breaking down the head of a fish pond, whereby fish may be lost, cutting down trees in an avenue or garden, sending threatening letters, selling cotton with forged stamps, and committing sacrilege. Shaw, pages 26 to 27. Crimes punishable by transportation into slave labor in America included stealing ore from lead mines, fishing in enclosed ponds, bigamy, and solemnizing a marriage in secret. Shaw, page 27.5. A felon was a pregnant, starving woman who stole a bowl of soup, a 12-year-old boy who had picked someone's pocket, or a young father like Thomas Atwood with a wife, child, and mother to support, sentenced to slavery in America because he had stolen a sheep to satisfy the cries of his family for bread at a time when he had it not to give them. Kirch, pages 27 to 28, 50, 67. They would be separated from their parents, children, or spouse and transported to the colonies, often for life. Catherine Davis, a pregnant seamstress, was convicted in a London court of stealing 7 yards of lace. She was separated from her husband, sentenced to slavery, and placed aboard the convict ship Forward. She gave birth on board. Her baby was dead within 2 weeks, its mother bound for Maryland. Kirch, page 111. Awaiting a slave ship in a Cambridge, England jail, the convict Mary Featherstone, charged with theft, gave birth to a baby boy. He was taken from her and she was transported to slavery in his Maj Estes plantations in America. Kirch, page 8. 5. Unfortunately, there tended to be one law for the rich and another for the poor. Eldon's confession in the House of Lords in 1827 that as a boy he had been a great poacher was greeted with laughter. Working-class English children were transported into slavery for stealing apples from a tree, a crime which was committed almost daily by most of the high-born youths of the country without fear of punishment. Shaw, page 163. 29. Laboring men often suffered abusive treatment in the colonies, but transported felons made especially easy prey. Marked with the stamp of infamy. Worse than Negroes, in fact, was the verdict of a Jamaican governor. Many convicts were already viewed in much the same way as slaves. Convict servants toiled under debased conditions not altogether different from black slavery. Some OB servers, in fact, held that convicts suffered harsher treatment. Like horses you must slave, and like galley slaves will you be used. Kirch, pages 140, 151, 156, 160. The convict label was so ubiquitous that it prompted Samuel Johnson's remark on Americans, "Sir, they are a race of convicts, and ought to be content with anything we allow them short of hanging." But even an exclusive focus on the indentured servant or apprentice class cannot conceal the fact of white slavery, because very often the distinctions between the two blurred. Large companies did not deal solely in convicts. Some participated in the indentured servant trade, so that servants and convicts were at times transported on the same ships. Eddies claimed that plant heirs too generally conceive an opinion that the difference is merely nominal between the indented servant and the convicted felon. Another believed that they, indentured servants, are obliged to serve like slaves or convicts, and are on the same footing. Such observations do afford tantalizing evidence that some white servants were gradually becoming associated, in the public mind, with convicts, and, further, that many convicts were already viewed in much the same way as slaves. Kirch, pages 75 and 156. Through a process of subterfuge and entrapment, white apprentices were regularly transformed into white slaves, as we shall see. White slaves were owned not only by individual aristocrats and rich planters, but by the colonial government itself or its governor. White slaves included not just paupers, but such wicked villains as vagrants, beggars, disorderly and other dissolute persons, as well as white children from the counties and towns of Britain who were stolen from their parents, though no Harriet Beecher Stowe rose to prominence in chronicling the anguish and hardship of these enslaved white children. White political prisoners sold into slavery. A large number of the white slaves arriving in America described as convicts were actually political prisoners. Of the Scottish troops captured at the Battle of Worcester, more than 600 were shipped to Virginia as slaves in 1651. The rebels of 1666 were sent as slaves to the colonies, as were the Monmouth rebels of 1685 and the Jacobites of the Rising of 1715. It is now commonly accepted that the African slave trade could not have operated for over 3 centuries without the active participation of some African states and political leaders. The human merchandise was obtained largely as a result of political conflicts between neighboring states and tribes. Less well known are the ways in which white slave laborers were obtained from the British Isles for the West Indies plantations in the 17th century. The English state ruthlessly rounded up victims of political conflict and prisoners of war at places like Dunbar, Worcester, Salisbury, and during territorial expansionism in Ireland for sale to West Indian merchants. In this respect, English governments and African political leaders were responding to the same market forces. Beckles, White Servitude, page 52. The Crown put tens of thousands of political dissidents in slavery, some being shipped to New land while others were deported to the plantations of the West Indies and worked to death in these lands' boiler houses, mills, and sugar-cane fields. Cromwell sold the white survivors of the massacre at Drogheda to slave traders in the Barbados, and thereafter it became his fixed policy to Barbados his opponents. Eric Williams, page 101. By 1655, half of the total white population of Barbados consisted of political prisoners sold into slavery. Jill Shepherd, The Red Legs of Barbados, is page 18. Establishment historians claim that only blacks were slaves because whites were released after a term of 7 or 10 years of servitude. But the history of the enslavement of Britain's political prison. 30. Ayres disproves this notion. Plantation owners saw it as their profitable and patriotic duty to extend the servitude of the political prisoners on the plantations far beyond the supposed 10 or 20-year limit. British political prisoners were shipped into slavery in America for life, not 7 or 14 years. Those who survived the voyage worked out their lives in bondage on the plantations of America. John Preble, Glencoe, page 65. After the Battle of Worcester in 1652, the first mention is made of royalists having been brought out to Barbados and sold as slaves. They had been taken prisoner at Exeter and Ilchester. From there they were driven straight to Plymouth, put on a ship where they remained below deck, sleeping amongst the horses. On arrival in Barbados, they were sold as chattel and employed in grinding the mills, attending to the furnaces and digging in the hot sun, whipped at the whipping post as rogues, and sleeping in sties worse than pigs. Ronald Tree, A History of Barbados, page 35. This was no temporary bondage. Of 1,300 cavaliers enslaved in 1652 in Barbados, almost all of them died in slavery. Bridenbaugh, pages 110 to 111, Heinrich von Upteritz, Cosrees, pages 3 to 10. The enslavement of white political prisoners in the West Indies was debated in the English Parliament on March 25, 1659. The practice was allowed to continue and was still in operation as late 1746, when Scottish Highland infantrymen and French and Irish regulars of the Jacobite army were transported into slavery in Barbados after the Battle of Culloden. Shepherd, page 3. Slave hunting in Britain. Whites convicted of no crime whatever were made slaves by being captured by press gangs in Britain and shipped into slavery in colonial America. These slave raids, also known as spiriting, began under the reign of King Charles I, continued during the Commonwealth period and throughout the reign of Charles II. It was an organized system of kidnapping English, Welsh, and Scottish workers, young and old, and transporting them to the American colonies to be sold, with the profits split between the press gangs and the shipmaster to whom the captured whites were assigned in chains. These slave hunting gangs were viewed with covert approval by the British aristocracy, who feared the overpopulation of the white underclass. Confiscatory levels of taxation and the enclosure laws had driven British small farmers and village dwellers off the land and into the cities, where they gaff-aired and loitered, a threat to the order and comfort of the propertied classes. 17th and 18th century economists advocated the enslavement of poor whites because they saw them as the cheapest and most effective way to develop the colonies in the New World and expand the British Empire. It was claimed that by making slave laborers out of poor whites, they were saved from being otherwise chargeable and unprofitable to the realm. As the plantation system expanded in the Southern American colonies, planters demanded the legalization of the practice of kidnapping poor whites. As it stood, laws were on the books forbidding kidnapping, but these were for show and were enforced with very infrequent, token arrests of spirits. The planters' need for white slave labor expanded to such an extent that they tired of having to operate in a quasi-legal manner. In response, in February 1652, it was enacted that it may be lawful for 2 or more justices of the peace within any county, city, or town corporate belonging to this Commonwealth to from time to time by warrant, cause to be apprehended, seized on and detained all and every person or persons that shall be found begging and vagrant, in any town, parish, or place to be conveyed into the port of London, or unto any other port, from where such person or persons may be shipped, into any foreign colony or plantation. Egerton Manuscript, British Museum. Parliamentary legislation of 1664 allowed for the capture of white children who were rounded up and shipped out in chains. Judges received 50% of the profits from the sale of the white youths, with another percentage going to the king. 31. With these laws, it was open season on the poor of Great Britain as well as anyone the rich despised. In 1682, 4 white men from Devon, England, were enslaved and transported to the colonies. The judges had indicted the 4 for wandering. From 1662 to 1665, the judges of Edinburgh, Scotland, ordered the enslavement and shipment to the colonies of a large number of rogues and others who made life unpleasant for the British upper classes. Register for the Privy Council of Scotland, 3rd Series, Volume 1, page 181, Volume 2, page 101. Scottish royalty had tenant farmers to whom they owed money, kidnapped and sold to slavers under the pretense that they had been ordered for transportation to the colonies as convict slave laborers. It has been whispered, Edward Burt affirmed, their crimes were only asking their dues. Edward Burt, Letters from a Gentleman, Volume 1, pages 54 to 55. In 1739, under the orders of 2 lairds on the Isle of Skye, Sir Alexander MacDonald and Norman MacLeod, over 100 men, women, and children were kidnapped one evening from their homes on Skye and several neighboring islands. As one of the victims later recounted, they were all guarded and delivered, and a good deal of them were at the same time bound and tied. The plan was to ship the prisoners to either New England or Pennsylvania, where they would be sold as servants. But when the vessel stopped to take on supplies at Donaghadee, in Northern Ireland, they escaped across the surrounding countryside, NEI. Their MacDonald or MacLeod was ever prosecuted. Kirch, page 32. In Charles County Court in Maryland in 1690, it was agreed that the indentures under which 7 white slaves were being held were kidnappers' indentures and therefore technically invalid. However, the court ruled that the white slaves should continue to be held in slavery to their various Colorado Nile masters based on the so-called custom of the country. The ladies of the royal court and the mayor of Bristol, England, were not beneath profiting from the lucrative traffic in poor white people. Every pretense was used to decoy the victims aboard ships lying in the Thames. The kidnapping of poor whites became a major industry in such English port cities as London, Plymouth, Southampton, and Dover, and in Scotland at Aberdeen, where the kidnapping of white children and their sale into slavery had become an industry. White children in chains. The kidnapping of English children into slavery in America is actually legalized during the first quarter of the 17th century. In that period, a large number of the children of poor parents, as well as orphan children, were targeted for the white slave trade. These poor white children were described as a plague and a rowdy element. Aristocrats who ran the Virginia Company, such as Sir Thomas Smythe and Sir Edwin Sandys, viewed the children as a convenient pool of slave laborers for the fields of the Virginia colony. In their petition to the Council of London in 1618, they complained of the great number of vagrant children in the streets and requested that they might be transported to Virginia to serve as laborers. A bill was passed in September of 161-8 permitting the capture of children aged 8 years old or older, girls as well as boys. The 8-year-old boys were to be enslaved for 16 years and the 8-year-old girls for 14 years, after which, it was said, they would be given land. Robert C. Johnson, The Transportation of Vagrant Children from London, Virginia, 1618 to 1622, in Early Stuart Studies, page 139. A directive was issued for the capture of children in London, empowering city aldermen to direct their constables to seize children on the streets and commit them to the prison hospital at Bridewell, where they were to await shipment to America. Johnson, pages 139 to 140. Their only crime was that they were poor and happened to be found loitering or sleeping in the streets when the constable passed by. Johnson, page 142. The street was not the only place child slaves were to be procured, however. The homes of indigent parents with large families were also on the agenda of the slave traders. Poor English parents were given the opportunity to surrender one or more of their children to the slavers. If they refused, they 32. Were to be starved into submission by being denied any further relief assistance from the local government. To carry out the provisions of the Act, the Lord Mayor, Sir William Cockayne, directed the alderman to make inquiry of those parents overcharged and burdened with poor children whether they wished to send any of them to Virginia. Those who replied negatively were to be told they would not receive any further poor relief from the parish. Johnson, page 142. The grieving parents were assured that the shipment of their children to Virginia would be beneficial to the children because it was a place where under severe masters they may be brought to goodness. Johnson, page 143. In January of 1620, a group of desperate, terrified English children attempted to break out of Bridewell, where they had been imprisoned while awaiting the slave ships to America. They rose up and fought. Matters were further complicated by the refusal of some of the children to be transported. In late January, a kind of revolt occurred at Bridewell, with some of the ill-disposed among the children declaring their unwillingness to go to Virginia. Johnson, page 143. A hasty letter from Sir Edwin Sandys to the King's Secretary, Sir Robert Naunton, quickly rectified the situation. On January 31st, the Privy Council decreed that if any of the children continued in their obstinance, they would be severely punished. It is possible that one of the children was actually executed as an example to the others. What is certain is that a month later the children, mostly boys, were forced on board the ship Duty and transported to Virginia. From thence onward, English male child slaves came to be known as duty boys. Alexander Brown, The First Republic in America, page 375. There would be many more shipments of these doomed children bound for the colonies in the years ahead. From that time on, little is known about them except that very few lived to become adults. When a muster or census of the Virginia colony was taken in 1625, the names of only 7 boys were listed, of the children kidnapped in 1619. All the rest were dead. The statistics for the children sent in 1620 are equally grim. No more than 5 were alive in 1625. Johnson, page 147. On April 30th, 1621, Sir Edwin Sandys presented a plan to the English Parliament for the solution of the threat poor English people posed to the fabulously wealthy aristocracy: mass shipment to Virginia, where they would all be brought to goodness. When control of the colony of Virginia passed from the privately held Virginia Company directly to the King, it was deemed more expedient, as time went on, to privatize the traffic in white children while placing it on an even larger basis to meet the cheap labor needs of all the colonies. In this way, the Crown avoided the opprobrium that might have been connected with the further official sale of English children, even as the aristocracy covertly expanded this slave trade dramatically. The early traffic in white children to Virginia had proved profitable not only for the Virginia Company, but for the judges and other officials in England who administered the capture of the children. J. Farrer, treasurer of the Virginia Company, indicated that he had been approached by the Marshal of London and other officials who had been involved in procuring children for the colony, proclaiming that they were owed a financial reward for their care and travail therein, that they might be encouraged hereafter to take the like pains whensoever they should have again the like occasion. The OFFI Sials subsequently received the handsome cut for their part in the loathsome traffic in kidnapped white children which they had desired. Susan M. Kingsbury, edition, The Records of the Virginia Company of London, Volume 1, page 424, and Johnson, pages 144 to 145. This collusion between the public and private sphere generated profits and established a precedent for many more occasions where like pains would be eagerly taken. The precedent established was the cornerstone of the trade in child slaves in Britain for decades to come, a trade whose center, after London, would become the ports of Scotland. Press gangs in the hire of local merchants roamed the streets, seizing by force such boys as seemed proper subjects for the slave trade. Children were driven in flocks through the town and con. 33. Fined for shipment in barns. So flagrant was the practice that people in the countryside about Aberdeen avoided bringing children into the city for fear they might be stolen, and so widespread was the collusion of merchants, shippers, suppliers, and even magistrates that the man who exposed it was forced to recant and run out of town. Van der Zee, bound over, page 210. This man was Peter Williamson, who as a child in 1743 was captured in Aberdeen and sold as a slave to the planter, a white Guineaman. The planter was destined for America with 70 other kidnapped Scottish children in addition to other freight. After 11 weeks at sea, the ship ran aground on a sandbar near Cape May on the Delaware River. As it began to take on water, the crew fled in a lifeboat, leaving the boys to drown in the sinking ship. The planter managed to stay afloat until morn ing, however, and the slavers returned to salvage their cargo. Peter Williamson was twice blessed. He not only survived the planter, but had the great good fortune to have been purchased by a former slave, Hugh Wilson, who had also been kidnapped in Scotland as a child. Wilson had fled slavery in another colony and now bought Williamson in Pennsylvania. He did so solely out of compassion, knowing the boy would be bought by someone else had Wilson not bought him first. Wilson paid for Williamson's education in a colonial school and years later on his death, bequeathed to the lad his horse, saddle, and a small sum of money, all Wilson had in the world. With this advantage, Williamson married, became an Indian fighter on the frontier, and eventually made his way back to Scotland, seeking justice for himself and on behalf of all kidnapped children, including his deceased friend Hugh Wilson. This took the form of a book, The Life and Curious Adventures of Peter Williamson, who was carried off from Aberdeen and sold for a slave. But when he attempted to distribute it in Aberdeen, he was arrested on a charge of publishing a scurrilous and infamous libel, reflecting greatly upon the character and reputations of the merchants of Aberdeen. The book was ordered to be publicly burned and Williamson jailed. He was eventually fined and banished from the city. Williamson did not give up, but sued the judges of Aberdeen and took sworn statements from people who had witnessed kidnappings or who had had their own children snatched by slavers. Typical was the testimony of William Jameson of Old Meldrum, a farming village 2 miles from Aberdeen. In 1741, Jameson's 10-year-old son John was captured by a spirit gang in the employ of Bonnie John Burnett, a powerful slave merchant based in Aberdeen. After making inquiries, Jameson learned that his son was being held for shipment to the Plantations. Jameson hurried to Aberdeen and frantically searched the docks and ships for his boy. He found him on shore among a circle of about 60 other boys, guarded by Bonnie John's slavers who brandished horsewhips. When the boys walked outside the circle, they were whipped. Jameson called to his son to come to him. The boy tried to run to his father. Father and son were beaten to the ground by the slavers. Jameson sought a writ from the Scottish courts, but was informed that it would be vain for him to apply to the magistrates to get his son liberated, because some of the magistrates had a hand in those doings. Jameson never saw his son alive again, having never heard of him since he was carried away. The testimony from Jameson and from many others helped Peter Williamson to prevail. The Aberdeen merchants were ordered by the Edinburgh Court of Sessions to pay him £100. Williamson was personally vindicated and his book was printed in a new edition. The kidnapping continued, however. The enslavement of white children from Great Britain later became the subject of a much better-known book, Robert Louis Stevenson's Kidnapped, which was based on the real-life case of James Annesley, whose uncle, the Earl of Anglesey, had arranged for him to be seized and sold into slavery in America, in order to remove any challenge to the Earl's inheritance of his brother's estates. Annesley was savagely whipped and brutally mistreated in America, and it appeared he would die in chains. He was eventually resold to another master who accepted his story that he was an English lord and the heir to the Anglesey barony. 34. Annesley managed to make his way back to Scotland, where he wrote a book, Memoirs of an Unfortunate Young Nobleman, returned from 13 years' slavery in America, which years later came to the attention of Robert Louis Stevenson. Unfortunately, this rare case involving the enslavement of a member of the English nobility attracted attention only because it involved royalty. The far more common plight of hundreds of thousands of poor British children who had languished and died in slavery in the colonies was ignored, and awareness of the history of their ordeal remained unchanged in the wake of the publication of Stevenson's classic. The head of one kidnapping ring, John Stewart, sold at least 500 white youths per year into slavery in the colonies. Stewart's thugs were paid 25 shillings for whites they procured by force, usually a knock in the head with a blunt instrument, or fraud. Stewart sold the whites to the masters of the White Guineaman slave ships for 40 shillings each. One eyewitness to the mass kidnapping of poor whites estimated that 10,000 were sold into slavery every year from throughout Great Britain, information in a pamphlet by M. Godwin, London, 1680. White losses in the Middle Passage higher than that of blacks. White slaves transported to the colonies suffered a staggering loss of life in the 17th and 18th century. During the voyage to America, it was customary to keep the white slaves below deck for the entire 9 to 12-week journey. A white slave would be confined to a hold not more than 16 feet long, chained with 50 other men to a board, with padlocked collars around their necks. The weeks of confinement below deck in the ship's stifling hold often resulted in outbreaks of contagious disease, which would sweep through the cargo of white freight chained in the bowels of the ship. Ships carrying white slaves to America often lost half their slaves to death. According to historian Sharon V. de Salinger, scattered data reveal that the mortality for white servants at certain times equaled that for black slaves in the Middle Passage, and during other periods actually exceeded the death rate for black slaves. Salinger, page 91. Salinger reports a death rate of 10 to 20% over the entire 18th century for black slaves on board ships en route to America, compared with a death rate of 25% for white slaves en route to America. Salinger, page 92. Foster R. Dulles, writing in Labor in America, A History, page 6, states that whether convicts, children spirited from the countryside, or political prisoners, white slaves experienced discomforts and sufferings on their voyage across the Atlantic that paralleled the cruel hardships undergone by Negro slaves on the notorious Middle Passage. Dulles says the whites were indiscriminately herded aboard the White Guineamen, often as many as 300 passengers on little vessels of not more than 200 tons burden, overcrowded, unsanitary. The mortality rate was sometimes as high as 50%, and young children seldom survived the horrors of a voyage which might last anywhere from 7 to 12 weeks. Independent investigator A.B. Ellis in the Argosy writes concerning the transport of white slaves, the human cargo, many of whom were still tormented by unhealed wounds, could not all lie down at once without lying on each other. They were never suffered to go on deck. The hatchway was constantly watched by sentinels armed with hangers and blunderbusses. In the dungeons below all was darkness, stench, lamentation, disease, and death. Marcus Jernagan describes the greed of the shipmasters, which led to horrendous loss of life for white slaves transported to America. The voyage over often repeated the horrors of the famous Middle Passage of slavery fame. An average cargo was 300, but the shipmaster, for greater profit, would sometimes crowd as many as 600 into a small vessel. The mortality under such circumstances was tremendous, sometimes more than half. Middleberger, an eyewitness, says he saw 32 children thrown into the ocean during one voyage. Jernagan, pages 50 to 51. The mercantile firms, as importers of white servants, were not too careful about their treatment, as the more important purpose of the transaction was to get ships over to South Carolina which could carry local produce back to Europe. Consequently, the Irish, as well as others, suffered greatly. 35. It It was almost as if the British merchants had redirected their vessels from the African coast to the Irish coast, with the white servants coming over in much the same fashion as the Araucan slaves. Warren B. Smith, page 42. A study of the Middle Passage of white slaves was included in Parliamentary Petition of 1659. It reported that white slaves were locked below deck for 2 weeks while the slave ship was still in port. Once underway, they were all the way locked up under decks, amongst horses. They were chained from their legs to their necks. Transports, travel in double irons, were whipped and beaten. Captains such as Edward Brock ETT of the Rappahannock Merchant were totally unfit. Ikirch, page 101. Of the white slaves bound for Maryland from London aboard the slave ship Justitia, at the mercy of the savage Captain Barnett Bond, nearly 1/3 of the whites died. The very worst excesses were revealed during the voyage of the Justitia in 1743. Under the command of Barnett Bond, Bond set stringent water rations. Despite MPLE reserves of water on board, he allotted each transport only 1 pint a day. Some started to drink their own urine. Ikirch, page 102. The former partner of Andrew Reed of the white slave trading firm of Reed and Armour wrote that Reed was the person against whom every species of complaint was made. Profits continued to flow in spite of the deaths of what the white slave trade firm of Stevenson, Randolph and Cheston referred to as the goods. The traffic in these goods, properly managed, will in a few years make us very genteel for tunes. The sales of the convicts run up amazingly in a little time. William Stevenson to James Cheston, September 12, 1768 and December 30, 1769, Cheston Galloway Papers, Maryland Historical Society. Once the slave ships left British shores, profit rather than penal policy shaped the character of transportation, and what happened to enslaved whites overseas mattered little. As soon as they were safely consigned to merchants, authorities assumed no responsibility for their welfare. Ikirch, page 3. White slaves aboard ship were treated worse than dogs or swine, and are kept much more uncleanly than those animals are. Shaw, page 35. A witness who saw a white slave aboard a ship owned by the slaver John Stewart reported, "All the states of horror I ever had an idea of are much short of what I saw this man in. Chained to a board in a hole not above 16 feet long, more than 50 with him, a collar and padlock about his neck, and chained to 5 of the most dreadful creatures I ever looked on." Another observer watching the AUC tie-in of 100 white slaves in Williamsburg, Virginia remarked, "I never seen such passels of poor wretches in my life. Some almost naked." Ikirch, pages 100 and 122. One white woman slave bound for Australia, Elizabeth Dudgeon, had dared to talk back to a guard. She was trussed up to a ship's grating and mercilessly whipped. One of the ship's officers relished watching her lashed. The corporal did not play with her, but laid it home, which I was very glad to see. She has long been fishing for it, which she has at last got to her heart's content. Journal of Ralph Clark, entry of July 3, 1787. In order to realize the maximum profit from the trade in white slaves, the captains of the White Guineamen crammed their ships with as many poor whites as possible, certain that even with the most callous disregard for the lives of the whites the financial gain would still make the trip worth the effort. A loss of 20% of their white cargo was regarded as acceptable. But sometimes losses were much higher. Out of 350 white slaves on a ship bound for the colonies in 1638, only 80 arrived alive. "We have thrown overboard 2 and 3 in a day for many days together," wrote Thomas Rouse, a survivor of the trip. A ship carrying white slaves in 1685, the Betty of London, left England with 100 white slaves and arrived in the colonies with 49 left. A number of factors contributed to the higher death rates for white slaves than blacks. Although the goal of maximum profits motivated both trades, it cost more to obtain blacks from Africa than it did to capture whites in Europe. White slaves were not cared for as well as blacks because the whites were cheaply obtained and were viewed as expendable. 36. The African slave trade was not fully established in the early 17th century. The price of African slaves was prohibitively high, and the English were neither familiar with nor committed to black slavery as a basic institution. Beckles, White Servitude, page 3. Ship captains involved in the white slave trade obtained white slaves with penal status either free of charge or were subsidized to take them, and for all other categories of white slaves, they paid at most a small sum to an agent to procure them, forfeiting only the cost of their keep on board ship if they died. 6. Moreover, traders in black slaves operated ships designed solely for the purpose of carrying human cargo with the intent of creating conditions whereby as many black slaves as possible would reach America alive. White slave ships were cargo ships with no special provisions for passengers. In addition, transportation rules decreed that, in cases where white slaves were sold in advance to individual planters in America, if the white slave survived the voyage beyond the halfway point in the journey, the planter in America, not the captain of the slave ship, would be responsible for the costs of the white slave's provisions whether or not the slave survived the trip. Captains of the slave ships became infamous for providing sufficient food for only the first half of the trip and then virtually starving their white captives until they arrived in America. Jammed into filthy holds, manacled, starved, and abused, they suffered and died during the cross. In gross numbers. Thousands were children under 12, snatched off the streets. Kendall, page 1. The transportation became a profitable enterprise. Traders delivered thousands of bound labor heirs to Pennsylvania and exhibited a callous disregard for their cargoes. Salinger, page 88. As a result, white slaves on board these ships suffered a high rate of disease. Transportation of white slaves remained a branch of commerce wedded to carrying human cargoes at minimal expense. Sizable numbers never reached American shores from disease, mistreatment. Ikirch, page 108. The number of diseased white slaves arriving was high enough for Pennsylvania officials to recommend a quarantine law for them. Thus, a new torment was to be endured for white slaves who were often stopped just short of the New World, with land in sight, and forced to remain quarantined on board ships in which they had just spent a horrifying 10 to 12 weeks. Salinger, page 89. In 1738, Dr. Thomas Graham reported to the Colonial Council of Pennsylvania that if 2 ships crammed with white slaves were allowed to land, it might prove dangerous to the health of the inhabitants of this province. Minutes of the Provincial Council of Pennsylvania, Colonial Records, for colon 306. Ships filled with diseased white slaves landed anyway. In 1750, an island was established for their quarantine, Fisher Island, at the mouth of Schuylkill River. But the establishment of the quarantine area did nothing to protect the health of the white slaves, and the island was more typical of Devil's Island than a place of recuperation. In 1764, a clergyman, Pastor Helmuth, visited Fisher Island and described it as a land of the living dead, a vault full of living corpses. White slaves treated worse than blacks. Before 1650, however, the greater victims of man's inhumanity were the mass of white Christian servants who suffered at the hands of callous, white Christian masters. For the time being, with all of their troubles, the blacks had it better. Riddenbaugh, page 120. 6. The greater part of the convict trade was concentrated in the hands of a few merchant companies. In London, which offered the special lure of the Treasury subsidy, several firms captured the market for the bulk of the century. Andrew Reed, a friend of the Secretary of the Treasury, was placed on the government's payroll. Reed had several partners, including James and Andrew Armour of London and John Stuart, a Scotsman. During the 1750s, Stuart and the Armours held the Treasury contract. Thereafter, Stuart was joined by fellow Scot Duncan Campbell. Other London merchants, though not government beneficiaries, trafficked in convicts on a smaller scale. There were 34 identifiable London firms involved in the trade to Maryland from 1746 to 1775. E. Kirch, pages 73 to 74. 37. Sold to a master in Marion, near Philadelphia, David Evans was put to work hewing and uprooting trees, land clearing, the most arduous of colonial labor, work that was spared black slaves because they were too valuable. Van der Zee, page 138. Negroes are, therefore, almost in every instance, under or comfortable circumstances than the miserable European, over whom the rigid planter exercises an inflexible rigidity. They are strained to the utmost to perform their allotted labor. They frequently try to escape, but very few are successful. And, when apprehended, are committed to close confinement, advertised, and delivered to their respective masters. The unhappy culprit is doomed to a severe chastisement, and a prolongation of servitude is decreed. Those who survive seldom establish their residence. William Eddy's Letters from America, published in 1792, Letter 6. In the British West Indies, the torture visited upon white slaves by their masters was routine. Masters hung white slaves by their hands and set their hands afire as a means of punishment. To end this barbarity, Colonel William Braine wrote to English authorities in 1656 urging the importation of Negro slaves on the grounds that, as the planters would have to pay much for them, they would have an interest in preserving their lives, which was wanting in the case of whites, many of whom, he charged, were killed by overwork and cruel treatment. Indentures, an organized racket. Even privileged 17th and 18th century apprentices often became slaves in the end, i.e. unpaid, forced laborers for life, based on contractual trickery, judicial malfeasance, and usury employed against them during their supposedly limited term as indentured servants. Such an apprentice would be enticed to borrow sums of money, sign a contract with impossible provisions guaranteeing his or her violation of the contractual terms, and other unscrupulous means of extending both the period of servitude as well as broadening the scope of the servant's obligations. By these means, an apprentice could be transformed into a slave for life. Free white people were sometimes induced to sign indentures and place themselves in voluntary temporary slavery with the promise of obtaining farm acreage at the end of their term of indenture. An American colony typically offered 50 acres to such persons. This was actually little more than an organized racket. The alleged servant had his or her land grant entrusted to the landowner for whom they labored, with the understanding that title would pass to the servant at the end of his term of labor. But he could forfeit his rights to this promised land on the slightest pretext of his owner, on such grounds as running away, the owner's word would do, or for indolence. For the price of a white slave's transport, £6, his owner secured a head right to the land which was supposedly intended to go to the servant, but which was instead combined with the land supposedly set aside for other white slaves and formed into an estate which would multiply in value. By this means, and with an occasional additional fee to an English merchant or spirit who provided the landowner with kidnapped extra white slaves, the plantation owners of colonial America played monopoly with the fertile valleys and wooded uplands of Maryland and Virginia. Meanwhile, the rightful owners of this land lay in paupers' graves or enshackled for life. This monopolistic grip on the land market was detrimental to all white laborers. Those white slaves who did manage to obtain their freedom after 30 or 40 years as chattel were swindled out of the spectral freedom dues of acreage, left to exist as landless peasants and scorned as hillbillies and white trash, in spite of decades of labor under monstrous conditions of hardship. One would like to think that some of the few survivors went on to become prominent leaders of the colony or were the founders of great families. This does not appear to be the case. Some were doubtless the progenitors of the poor white trash of the South. Many of the free whites who had descended from the poorer elements of the white servant class became objects of charity. Johnson, p. 147, Jernigan, pages 56 and 178. 38. At no time after 1640 in either Barbados or St. Christopher, and probably Nevis, was there any cheap land enough for a man to purchase with his freedom dues. The vast majority never became landholders. Bridenbaugh, page 113. It then became the custom to give the servant at the end of his term, not land, but 300 pounds of sugar, worth less than 2 pounds sterling. LT was hardly worth the servants while to endure the conditions which have been described for $4 worth of sugar. Eric Williams, pages 102-103. Freed white slaves experienced hard times. In a study of 145 white freedmen residing in Kent County, Maryland, only 5 could be traced with reasonable certainty in property records for all of Maryland, including wills, estate inventories, and debt books, which were compilations of landholdings. And among the 5 former white slaves who did leave an inventory of their goods, none was well-to-do. A study of All Hallows Parish, Maryland, has shown that whereas 1/3 of adult white males did not own land around 1700, nearly half were non-landowners by the middle of the century. In the mid-18th century, newly freed servants trying to enter the ranks of small planters encountered severe obstacles. Besides lacking capital to buy tools, seed, livestock, few of them could afford the land. In Virginia, large numbers never received freedom dues. Moreover, years of servitude so ruined the health of some former white slaves that no one would hire them once they were free. E. Kirch, pages 179, 180, 182-183. In fact, some white slaves, out of extreme poverty, signed new contracts of indenture, contributing to a pattern of lifelong servitude. These white former slaves' share of the accumulated wealth of the American colonies, measured by any standard, was negligible. Their say in the planter aristocracy was virtually non-existent. They were the expendable byproducts and survivors of a system of exploitation governed solely by merchant companies chartered in England by aristocratic fiat. It was the exclusive government by a merchant company which Adam Smith assailed as the worst of all governments for any country. Often working conditions were made especially gruesome toward the end of the period when the servant's contract was due to expire in order to induce him to run away, lose his 50 acres, and be held extra years in enslavement for fleeing. Toward the end of the term of servitude, working conditions would often be deliberately worsened, tempting the man to run away so the master might gain these advantages. Kendall, page 7. Of 5,000 indentured servants who entered the colony of Maryland between 1670 and 1680, fewer than 1,300 proved their rights to their 50-acre freedom dues. What had become of the others? More than 1,400 died from overwork, chronic malnourishment, and disease. The others were defrauded. By the 18th century, the white servant class was disillusioned. The planters had squashed the laboring whites. They were the easy pawns of the planters, who despised them. Beccles, rebels, and reactionaries, pages 18 to 19. The statutes overseeing non-penal indentured servitude in colonial America were mere window dressing, and neither these statutes or the common law proved any obstacle to the gradual enslavement of those with the non-penal status of indentured servant, by means of tacking on extra time to be served, on the basis of fabricated or trumped charges and minor offenses. Of Virginia law of 1619 provided that if a servant willfully neglect his master's commands, he shall suffer bodily punishment. When Wyatt became governor in 1621, he was ordered to see that punishment for offenses committed by white slaves would also be in terms of labor on behalf of the Colorado Nile government, such labor to be performed after the slave fulfilled his original period of service to his master. This is the evil practice of lengthening the time required for the white person's term of labor, a practice which quickly resulted in the lengthening of the term of service by years and ended in the perpetual enslavement of the white. While it is true that the common law of England had the status of national law with territorial extent in the colonies, the relation of master to servant in cases of what began as non-penal indentured ser. 39. The tud was unknown to the common law and could neither be derived from nor regulated by it, cf. Richard B. Morris, Massachusetts, and the Common Law, American History Review, 1926. Both indentured servitude and the white slavery permitted under the rubric of the penal codes depended for their regulation and sanction on special local statutes and tribunals which acted as the necessities of the occasion demanded. The legacy of white enslavement, bound up in the medieval English legal concept of villanage, contributed an informal framework, or milieu at least, for legitimizing the enslavement of the white poor in British America. In this light, Richard B. Morris is only partially correct. There was in fact precedent for white slavery in common law, but it was little cited in the colonies, perhaps because such formal legal citation would have exposed the indentures racket for what it was. 5. Biblical provisions for bound and hired labor were cited to justify white slavery in early America, on the grounds that it was scriptural and therefore humane. The Body of Liberties of 1641, the first law code of Puritan New England, established 4 categories of servitude, citing Exodus 21 verse 2, Leviticus 25, 39-55, and Deuteronomy 23 verses 15 to 16. However, had those scriptures actually been obeyed, the enslavement of Christians, the heirs of the Israelites, would never have taken place. Deuteronomy mandates that a bondsman is not to be oppressed. Exodus decrees that the term of service will under no circumstance exceed 6 years. Leviticus forbids forced slavery for the payment of debts as well as child slavery, cf. 25, 40-41. The permanent enslavement of racial aliens and their children was permitted, Leviticus 25 verses 45-46, Exodus 21 verse 4, which destroys the whole basis of Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural address. 6. Then as now, religious hypocrites of churchianity, as it more properly may be called, ignored Bible teachings on the subject even as they cited them for purposes of their own justification in enslaving fellow white Christians for pecuniary gain. It should be noted that some individual masters in early America who felt convicted by the scriptures regulating bonded kinsmen moderated their treatment of white bondsmen accordingly. In colonial America, white people could be enslaved for such an offense as missing church services more than 3 times or for prevention of an idle course of life. In 1640, a Virginia master needed to ensure further labor from his white servants in order to place his investments and land improvements on a more secure basis. He therefore falsely accused a number of his servants of a conspiracy to run out of the colony and enticing divers others to be actors in the same conspiracy. As a result of his accusation, the alleged runaways were severely whipped and had their term of forced labor lengthened an additional 7 years, to be served in irons. This can be regarded as a light sentence in view of the fact that 7 years was a standard addition of the term of labor for the crime of running away, or conspiring to do so, to which would then be added, in terms of additional time, the expenses incurred for capture and return of the white to his master, such costs being likely to include rewards, sheriffs' and slave hunters' bounties and jail fees. These latter were not fixed by law until 1726 and were a source of tremendous abuse by tacking on huge costs to the capture of the runaway and then commanding that the runaway pay for these in flat costs in terms of years of his life in further forced labor. A white slave who fled or was accused of fleeing often had his term of labor extended 7, 10, or even 15 years as a result. White slave Lawrence Finney received an additional 7 years, 11 months of forced labor for running away, while escaped white slave William Fisher, on being caught, received an additional term of 6 years and 250 days. Petitions, Chester County, Pennsylvania, Court of Quarter Sessions, August 1731 and June 1732. Just for being absent from the plantation at any time, a white slave would be forced to undergo 1 additional year of slavery for every 2 hours he was absent. Beckles, White Servitude, page 84. Starving white slaves who took extra food from their masters' overflowing larders were enslaved another 2 years for each commission of that crime. Punishment of runaway white slaves, Virginia, 1643. Whereas, there are divers loitering runaways in the colony who very often absent themselves from their master's service. Be it therefore. 40. Enacted and confirmed that all runaways that shall absent themselves from their said master's service shall be liable to make satisfaction by service at the end of their time of indenture, viz., double the time of service so neglected, and in some cases more, if the commissioners for the place find it requisite and convenient. Henning's Statutes at Large, Volume 1, 254 and 255, emphasis supplied. Further accusations, infractions and violations added to these editions and in some amounted to a lifetime of total enslavement and not the allegedly limited, benign white indentured servitude the Professor Cracks fleetingly refer to on their way to their semester-long devotion to Negro slave studies. Indeed, 1/2 of white indentured servants did not live to attain their freedom. Should anyone think this grim datum refers mainly to whites enslaved in old age, it actually refers to whites who were first indentured between the ages of 16 and 20. Bridenbaugh, page 123. The truth is, wrote white slave Edward Hill, we live in the fearfulest age that ever Christians lived. In Enslavement of the White Family. Young white females in bondage were denied the right to marry, a clever device for helping extend their servitude into full-fledged slavery, since the penalty for a woman having a baby out of wedlock while a slave was an extension of her term of slave labor another 2.5 years. A white male slave had at least 4 years added to his time for having sex with a white female slave or for entering into a compact of marriage with her. 23-year-old Henry Carman, a white slave since he had been kidnapped in London at the age of 17, made white slave Alice Chambers pregnant and received an additional 7 years slavery for this crime. Johnson, page 148. A Virginia law of 1672 recognized that there were masters who had lengthened the enslavement of their white female slaves by making them pregnant by the slave master himself. No punishment was given to the master for such acts, however. As bad as this may seem, it cannot compare with the dreadful fate that awaited the children of the enslaved white mother. The bastard or obscene children, as they were called, of unmarried white women slaves were bound over to the mother's slave master for a period of 31 years. This heinous child slavery from birth was not modified until 1765, when the Assembly of Virginia declared it to be an unreasonable severity to such children and limited the term of bondage for such white children to a mere 21 years for boys and 18 years for girls. This enslavement of white children in colonial America was based on the rule of the ancient Roman slave code, which decreed, partis sequitur ventrem, the condition of the child follows the condition of the mother, and which was assimilated by English legal scholars and applied in the colonies. The following is an entry describing one such case of infant enslavement. Margaret Mike had been servant to Mr. David Crawley, having a bastard child. Mr. Crawley prays the gentlemen of this vestry to bind out the said child as they think fit. It is ordered by the vestry that the church wardens bind out the said child named John Sadler, born the July 26th last, 1720. The foresaid child is by indenture bound unto Mr. David Crawley to serve according to law. The Vestry Book and Register of Bristol Parish, Virginia, 1720 to 1789. At other times the baby was forcibly separated from the white slave mother shortly after birth. White woman Sally Brant was enslaved to the wealthy Quaker family of Henry and Elizabeth Drinker. Quack heirs were strong campaigners against Negro slavery, but some had few qualms about white slavery. When Sally Brant's baby was born in the Dringers' country house, Sally was forced by the Drinkers to return to their main house in Philadelphia, leaving the newborn infant behind with a stranger. The white slave father of the child was also not allowed to see his baby, and the infant subsequently died. Elizabeth Drinker, the wealthy Quaker slave owner, kept a diary in which she philosophically noted that the death of her white slave's baby had most likely worked out for the best. 41. Unmarried, white, women servants who became pregnant, as did an estimated 20%, received special punishment. All had to serve additional years. Some had their children taken from them and sold, for a few pounds of tobacco, to another master. Levine, page 52. By 1769, all children born to even free white women who were unmarried were also candidates for enslavement. In 1769, the church wardens were instructed to bind out illegitimate children of free single white women. Jernigan, page 180. When hell was in session.
Gratitude, people. This is a document. They were white and they were slave. So no, I have another probably 2.5, 3 hours worth of reading to go. So I'll end it right here and call this part 1 and then present part 2, where the computer can read this information. So my common people, especially here on this location, Zamayaka, now called Jamaica, misnomered by the Spanish, calling it Jamaica, which is a Spanish word. But we as Ahuuak, we say Zamayaka. For the people here, specifically, I just want to know have this information so you can redirect your concept. So when you look at others out there, You'll have a foundational concept to know that you are not the same as everyone out there. So it's a gratitude, complete gratitude. And again, when we do get the time, we'll present part 2 and continue to move forward. Freedom, free dominion, free domain. To God be the glory. To the Most High Creator of nature be the glory. To our Great Spirit, Hawa, be the glory. Complete gratitude. Perfect love, Aborigines. Perfect love.